All right, ladies and gentlemen, Derek Lambert, MythVision Podcast. Looking forward to this live. This is going to be a wonderful live. We're going to be delving into with Dr. Steve Mason. And what was that noise in the background? I don't know. I heard Dr. Steve Mason. Thanks for tuning in. Make sure as you guys come in, you hit the like button, show us some love, let that algorithm, pay attention to MythVision so we keep growing. You're going to hear some education today. A lot of people pay a lot of money to go to college and learn some of the stuff that we're actually discussing here for free for everyone to hear. It's a really cool community. And if you're new to MythVision, welcome. I'm glad you guys are joining in. So we'll go ahead and get a quick intro started here in just a second and delve into the first generation Christians. Guys, let's go ahead. I'm gonna tell you the reference behind my intro on the Leviathan. So Yahweh destroys Leviathan. There's the lore that he creates the universe from his corpse because Marduk does the same to Tiamat. Well, Derek Lambert does the same for MythVision. I destroy the dragon and then comes the flood. We are MythVision. I'm your host, Derek Lambert. Welcome to MythVision Podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be talking about first generation Christians. Hit the like button. Make sure you guys check it out. But most of all, let me introduce you to our guest, Dr. Steve Mason. Welcome to MythVision.
Hey, thanks for having me back, Derek.
Thank you for joining me. I have been nothing but educated by everything that you say, your patience and your carefulness, and I'm not certain. I respect all of that you bring to the table, because too often we start with, we know. And I found out the more I learn, the more I don't know. Like, it's like the more you know, the more you realize how much you don't. But the people who know it all, I hate to say it, run, okay? Run. I'm just kidding. But we're going to talk about the early generation Christians. And before we do, I want everyone to know that you have a book specifically on this, Early Christian Reader. They can go on Amazon. Really, there's a link down in the description. You guys can get Dr. Mason's books. I have them like all inside the MythVision recommended link down in the description. And we're losing track here now. Here we go. So just look up Steve Mason. Well, really, you go to the recommended MythVision books, you'll see him there. Also, ladies and gentlemen, don't forget, MythVision has a Patreon. So there's Dr. Peter Singer right there on morality, ethics. I have a ton of videos that have not been released to the public. And I don't know why my screen's not loading. There it is. Okay, here's one on the Exodus right here. I had Dr. Ronald Hindall talk about a cultural memory. Shermer was released yesterday, and hundreds. It's running slow, so bear with me. Hundreds of videos on the Patreon. You guys join, and you'll get early access. I'm going to be flying a lot of these scholars and interviewing them in person. All of that content will be early on Patreon, and there's no telling when all of that will be released for the public. It's as simple and as little as $3 a month. You guys can go up from there if you really want to, I don't know, twist my arm and get my attention, and have me smile. That's wonderful. And also there's a GoFundMe. So you guys, there's the GoFundMe with Elaine Pagels and Dr. John J. Collins. The cool thing about Collins' GoFundMe is there's Joel Baden as well. So both doctors will be hit. Two birds with one stone. If you guys can help out with that, that'd be wonderful. We met the goal with Dr. Carrier, and I'll be seeing Dennis R. McDonald as well while we're there. So there's all sorts of good stuff coming here. And then I guess I'll save the best for last, if this is selfish. It's my birthday, ladies and gentlemen. Really, tomorrow is technically my 33rd birthday. Dr. Mason is actually John the Baptist preparing the way for me. I will be crucified here soon. I'm just saying, let's not draw in too many bad people in our crowds. We might not look like insurrectionists, and the state might not come and get us. So Thanks for joining me. Sorry for this long, funny little whatever intro. But yeah, guys, if you want to super chat me, show me some love, you can for the birthday. Anyway, Dr. Mason, leaving it to you, sir.
Okay, I'm going to try to fill the middle part of the screen here, Derek, with the presentation.
All right.
Can you see that now?
I can. Yes, sir.
All right, let's get going. The first Christian generation. Look, I don't want to oversell this topic, but it's kind of the most important thing in Western history. I mean, this kind of 30-year period is, if you think of the 2,000 years that Christianity has, pretty much dominated not only the West, but really prevailed in politics in the Far East, the Middle East, and so on as well, that the first generation, how it all began, is kind of important, right? I think. So today, we're going to be taking a look at that. And what I'll we can't cover every possible thing, of course. So what I want to propose to you and the audience today is that Paul's letters do give us an amazing window, in fact, the only window that is plausible into this very first generation. And it's full of surprises. If you've gone to church, you've heard sermons, you've gone to Sunday school, or you just, see Christianity from afar, you probably have impressions of it that, they're cliched a bit, they're stereotyped, they're fixed, they're traditional. But this is full of surprises, and I hope that by the end of our session, we're going to see a lot of surprises, and also see why Paul is important. So all I want to do to make it simple today is, because we're doing the whole thing in one session here, is apply the principles we discussed in a previous session together, Derek. We talked about the task of the historian, history being simply the investigation of the human past, and then the tasks of the historian, as you'll remember this, and many of your audience will, I'm sure, interpretation of what has survived, right, from whatever the period is that interests us. What's the context? What does it mean? So interpret the stuff we can look at from that time, and then try to reconstruct what is lost from the world in which it once lived, right? And these are questions that we think up, or they may be questions we think up. So we're not limited to whatever the surviving stuff tells us or claims to tell us. We can then ask our own questions, of course. And then that's what history is, those two things. So I simply want to apply this to the first generation. Hypothetically, if there was such a thing, and this is what I want to get into immediately, this would be what I'm talking about in terms of a generation, let's say around 30 CE. So if Jesus was a guy, if he was crucified by Pontius Pilate, it happened roughly around 30 CE, give or take 3-4 years. And then the first generation would be to, just before the destruction of the temple, say 35 years. So somebody's life from 20 to 55, or 25 to 60, or something like that. A generation, an adult generation. That's what I mean by the first Christian generation. This crucial period between Jesus' death and resurrection, if there was a Jesus who in any way connects with early Christianity. So we want to interpret what has survived, if anything, from this period, and try to reconstruct the lost world. What has survived? Well, the most obvious description of this period comes from Acts, the book of Acts in the New Testament. That's what it does. It describes the period from Jesus' purported resurrection to the 60s CE, right? But the problem is Acts is a secondary source for this period. It wasn't written during the period. It's at least one, probably, I think, 2 or 3 generations after the events. And it's already, therefore, much influenced in its retelling by all the stuff that's happened, since. So it doesn't give us a direct window. There are, however, all of these letters attributed to a guy who called himself an apostle, a lot of other people didn't, from this time. And so the question is, are any of these letters authentic? That's the first question we have. Derek, are you still with me?
I am, absolutely.
Okay. You can jump in at any time, right? You can see I'm just trying to set the foundations here of historical inquiry, right? Pulling on what we've talked about before. So those traditional letters, that is, letters traditionally ascribed to Paul, are 14. And I'm not going to list them all. You've heard the names before. Already in the ancient world, some of these were doubted. Especially the so-called letter to the so-called Hebrews. I won't keep saying so-called because everything is so-called. So already in antiquity, people said, this letter doesn't even name Paul as the author. So some people thought it was by him because it ends with a reference to our brother Timothy visiting. But it's like little greetings at the beginning and the end. This is a very long essay, which doesn't really sound like Paul. It's not written in his style. So already in the ancient world, many people didn't think, many Christians didn't think it was by Paul, actually. And then fast forward to the modern period, 19th century scholars doubted all the letters. And then eventually the so-called Tübingen school in Germany, this group of scholars, a very critical mindset, they ended up saying, well, we think at least 4 of them are authentic. Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Galatians. The general view today is that 7 are from Paul, not, therefore, 2nd Thessalonians, 1st, 2nd Timothy, Titus, Colossians, Ephesians, or Hebrews. So half of them are genuine, the other half not. Now, I don't want to take that as an assumption. I just want to put it out there as a position to push against, right? To think, okay, that's the dominant kind of hypothesis. Very conservative scholars would include more. And even some quite critical scholars would include Colossians, for example, or possibly 2nd Thessalonians. But most people say you're pretty safe with these 7. If they are genuine, they provide absolutely crucial evidence, in fact, the only evidence, primary evidence for the first generation of Christ followers. And I'm going to suggest that although we cannot know for sure, we can't know almost anything for sure, that these 7 seem to be genuine. And that's the working hypothesis I'm going to go with. So what I hope we can do in this little session is get straight to some very basic issues around this group of Christ followers following Paul and all of his enemies who are also Christ followers, and bring to life, reconstruct this vibrant, febrile atmosphere where people are really in serious conflict with each other, and then ask ourselves, what's the best explanation of that? So ultimately, people want to ask about, the historical Jesus, who was he? But of course, we don't have anything from him. So this is how it looks to me. This is what I'm going to try to suggest to you, visually speaking. I'm a Mac user, I think in visual terms. So I kind of visualize it like this. The great thing about Paul's writings are that they are letters. And that's the point I want to come back to in a second. They're not essays. And therefore, each one of them actually tells us a lot about what else is going on because of this vibrant disagreement in the first generation. Next time we talk, if we do the next one, if you're still up for this, Derek, we'll look at Mark and the second generation.
You already know. You can't tease me with this.
and then maybe we'll have a look at Luke-Acts in a future session sometime. But this is basically how I see it. And what I want to suggest is, you see these 3 main arrows with a 4th one cropping up in the middle. Already from the beginning, right in the first generation, you see at least 3 major different paths in Christ following. And the question is, what lies beneath all of this? What's the best? What's the most economical, simplest explanation of this radical diversity right from the earliest texts that we have? So what's going on there? So if they are real, they come from the 30s to the 50s, and they involve Jesus' own brother, James. So Jesus is out of the picture by now, but his brother, James, is a big shot in Jerusalem. Jesus' students, Peter and John especially, are big shots. And they are in some conflict with Paul. So the letters would give us, if they are genuine, a window into the first generation. Now, I'm quite well aware that not everybody, especially this channel is called MythVision. I'm aware of the mythicist view, and it's not one single view, but many. Yeah, go ahead.
Let me just say one thing. I didn't name it mythicist vision. The reason I named it MythVision is because myth is it's in everything. I mean, in the ancient world, it's in everything. So I don't want people to get that idea that this is a mythicist channel. We entertain all ideas, at least reasonable, ideas, and hearing scholars that are serious that entertain that idea. So they reject the whole James being the brother of Jesus, of course, but we're going to roll with your idea and see how it plays out.
Yeah, because that's the point here, is to test hypotheses for their explanatory power. That's what we're doing. That's what we do in history, right? Is anything is possible. Almost anything is possible, but we have to see, how well it explains the evidence. So I'm aware that, and I'm sorry about that if I seem to attribute.
No. I'm glad you said it. I like to clarify because some people go, "Oh, it's a mythicist channel, MythVision," and I admit when I named it, I was a mythicist.
Yeah.
But I'm currently, I lean historicist today. So this is just, I'm very open about it, but I'm willing to go wherever I think it makes the most sense. And so.
Well, and you're quite right that, mythos in Greek just means story, right? So there are stories with all kinds of elements in them. So yeah, I get it. But anyway, many of your viewers would be inclined toward a mythicist view of early Christianity. So I want to say right away that, I'm aware of that. So these letters could be, in principle, they could be fabrications, literary fabrications from the late first century, the early second century. You mentioned a couple of chats ago, somebody who's arguing everything begins in around 1000 or 1100. So, I mean, they could be from 1100 CE. I mean, the problem is then you have to explain the evidence. All right, that's the only thing. So none of this is ruled out. And we need to take seriously the point that there were lots and lots, tons of pseudonymous letters, that is, forged letters in the ancient world, pseudonym, written under pseudonyms, right? Or that is, the author is not the person he or she claims to be. So letters circulated in the names of Plato, Aristotle, Brutus, the famous philosopher involved in Caesar's assassination, the letter of Aristeas, some people will be familiar with, and Paul, in fact, even Paul's letters. So everybody pretty much believes that these letters are forgeries in Paul's name. In fact, 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 2, even, it's quite ironic because most scholars think it's a forgery, but the author of that letter says, "Don't be fooled by letters purporting to be from me," which are not from me. So it's quite funny. I mean, if that's a forged letter already, the author is protesting that you should only look at genuine letters from Paul. The so-called Muratorian canon, which is a list of texts, in the accepted by Christians, sometimes dated to the 2nd century, sometimes to the 4th century. This letter is a Christian letter or a list, and the author says the letter to the Laodiceans and to the Alexandrians, they're forgeries. right? They're not to be accepted. And we know about the Acts of Paul and Thecla in the 2nd century is a forgery made by somebody who said he really liked Paul and was trying to, imitate Paul. So there are lots and lots of forged letters in the ancient world, and that's why we have to say everything is on the table, right? We don't dismiss anything out of hand. So what are our criteria? First of all, you have to deal with the fact that these letters are cited by later authors than the letters themselves. So this text called First Clement, it looks like it was written, I mean, pretty much everybody, Bart Ehrman, for example, who did a critical edition of it, dates it before 100 because of various references in it, for example, to leaders who were appointed by the apostles. Now, this can be forged itself, but the point is, it quotes Paul. It bases itself on Paul's letter to the Corinthians, the first letter. Then letters of Ignatius.
Speaking of which, if you don't mind, we had a super chat that's in the vein of Corinthians real quick. Are the links to Paul, and thank you for the super chat and the happy birthday. Thank you for that. Are the links of Paul's letters typical for the ancient world? I know, for example, 1 Corinthians is usually broken up into 2 or 3 different texts.
2 Corinthians is. Don't know so much about 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians is most often treated as a unity, but thank you for the question. It's the question is, are they an unusual length? Yes and no. So Philemon is quite an ordinary length. Galatians, Philippians, that's pretty much in normal length. These are 3-4 pages. 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, if genuine. All of these letters are normal. Romans is not. Romans is like gigantic. And that's why, I don't know if people know this, but the letters in the New Testament are arranged not in chronological order, but in order of length. And so Romans comes first only because it's the longest one. And then they get shorter, and then they go to the personal letters. So it's letters to groups getting shorter, and then the letters to persons getting shorter. You have letters, however, by Cicero, by Pliny, that are fairly long. Probably not as long as Romans generally. So Romans is a bit of an outlier, but there's a reason for that. Even if it's a genuine letter, which is that Paul hasn't met the people he's writing to. So he's trying to defend and introduce himself. So does that help, do you think, answer the question?
I think so. I hope so. Yeah. Awesome says, yes, it was 2 Corinthians that most scholars break up. So,
and so there are the citations in Ignatius' letters in 1 Clement. So the question is, what are they citing, right? And also the forgeries themselves. If these are Colossians, Ephesians, 1st, 2nd Timothy, Titus, are people, students of Paul, second generation, trying to imitate Paul, where do they come from? And what are they citing? So the question is it easier to imagine there were some genuine letters which were then forged, or that they're all forged, right? That's the first criterion. The second one is much more subjective, and this is a judgment about their real life quality. Did they look like letters in real time or more abstract later? And this is something I can't demonstrate to you. I can only tell you that I think it's much easier to just think about it in the abstract and say, oh, these could be later letters, than it is to work through them line by line, to write a commentary. That book you mentioned, I worked through these in the Greek text. I had to teach this stuff. If you stand in front of a classroom, and today we're looking at 1 Thessalonians, and you're going to go through it line by line, you still have to come up with a very compelling explanation of it.
Show your book again, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Oh, hold on 1 second. Let me pull you up instead. I'm gonna drag you over here. All right, that's a must get.
I don't know about that, but it has a lot of the kind of thing that we're going to be talking about today in much greater detail. It's got the texts themselves with a kind of historical commentary and an introduction, beginning with First Thessalonians. So, yeah. My simple point here is we can debate this stuff in the abstract, but the explanation you come up with has to work when you're standing in front of a classroom and you're trying to explain what's going on. And if you just say, well, I think this is from the 2nd century, the main problem for me is it doesn't help me explain the text. I have to stand there and make a class out of it, right? So
right.
I don't know what to do with that. Like, how does it explain what's actually going on here? Because these are not essays. They are not, free creations. And that's the point I want to drive home. The letters that people agree are spurious letters, including not only pseudo-Pauline letters, but James, 1st and 2nd Peter, so the letters ascribed to those guys,
right,
tend to be quite abstract. And that's even a distinguishing feature of Colossians and Ephesians, is that they work out an idea, right? They're kind of philosophical, they're theological, and they just stick on a greeting at the beginning and the end. But what's different about these letters that seem genuine is that they are they're very curtailed. They're very abrupt. They stop. They don't explain things. They seem like half of a conversation, and that's a point I want to come back to. The forgeries assume something genuine. So what's going on there if there was nothing genuine in the first place? How do you explain that? Now, the letters that are really half of a conversation and have quite puzzling content in them because you're only hearing half, like overhearing a telephone conversation, I would suggest are more likely to be genuine. So, Derek, I want to ask you.
Yeah.
I want to give you 3 scenarios here.
Okay.
First one is you're in your living room and your wife is talking on the phone.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever had the experience where you might be doing something else, but you're kind of curious and you begin to piece together who she's talking to?
Every day.
Yeah. Okay.
She does it to me too. So yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, we all do this, right? If you're in a relationship, you know the drill. It's just like involuntary, right? We're just curious, and
exactly.
There's a phone call, and it's like a little detective game, and it might take 3 or 4 words, it might take 3 sentences, but you gradually, and then you kind of relax, right? Okay, I'll go on with what I'm doing. I know. It's not. It's just a game, right? You're just trying to figure out. I know who it is.
Or it's just curiosity. It's just curiosity.
Yeah, just curiosity. And what are the cues you would have typically to know who she's talking to?
Depending on the context in particular, because I might know that it's her sister because there's a lawyer's name gets brought up or something, because I know that she's going through a court issue right now with her ex-husband, and not trying to air out all the dirty laundry, but
no, but that's the kind of thing, right? Because you can piece together the other side of the conversation. That's the point, right? So that's the first scenario. First scenario is I'm listening to half of a conversation from somebody I know very well, I'm close to, I know their family, I know the situation. So you would say you can understand that conversation even though you're only hearing half of it. Is that correct?
Yes, I don't know the full context, but yes, I get the gist of what is happening in the conversation.
It makes sense to you, right? Yeah.
Right.
Okay, second scenario. You're walking down the street. Say you're in London, you go by Hyde Park, and there's Hyde Park Corner where the people get up on soapboxes, and preachers and philosophers and communists and socialists and whoever has got something to proclaim. If you stand there and listen to them for half an hour while they give their spiel, will you understand them or not? Likely.
I mean, I would get what they're trying to say. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That's scenario number 2. Now I want to contrast that with scenario number 3, which is you're walking down the street in a city and you walk by some guy. This happens every day, right? And you hear somebody's on the phone, and this is a complete stranger. and you hear them say, say you're stuck at a light, you can't cross the road, so you've got a minute there to stand there, and you hear them say, "Oh, well, what'd your mother think of that?" Okay, well, I don't know. I don't really care for that. Okay, well, let's try the other one. Okay. Oh, and what should we do with Bob and Wendy? Right. Okay, you hear this kind of conversation.
Right.
Do you understand any of it?
I get what's going on in the sense that it sounds like there's a differing opinion probably, or an agreement with the mother-in-law on some type of issue, but I don't know the context completely. No.
Right. We don't know, and we don't know what the thing is being referred to. We don't know who Bob and Wendy are. We don't know anything. Right.
Right.
So the point I want to make from this is very simple, but central to the whole thing. If you find letters that look like genuine conversation halves, right, they are going to have puzzling content. It's much harder to explain why someone would write this at another time. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
If they wanted to write their view of early Christianity, they'd write an essay, or write a letter essay that had, just like Colossians and Ephesians, stick a greeting in the beginning and end, or Hebrews, and say everything they want to say, make it look like a letter, right? But if it's a real letter, it's unintelligible to strangers, and that suggests that it's genuine, because otherwise, why would someone write it? And the proposition I want to make is that it's actually easier to declare some of the letters of Cicero, Pliny, or the Oxyrhynchus letters. There's a big fund of thousands of letters found in Oxyrhynchus in Egypt. It's easier, I think, to declare some of them spurious, though nobody does, than at least these 7 from Paul. And I want to explain that very quickly before we move on. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. I went
backwards.
I
got the context there. That's for sure.
I got carried away with my. Sorry about that, everybody watching. Now I have to just. This is a little recap of what we've been talking about.
Hit the like button, ladies and gentlemen, and don't forget it's my birthday. So you guys, if you want to throw me super chats, please. Anyway, that'll help us waste some time.
Here we go. The other way to ask this question is, what problems? So what I'm going to do is argue that these letters look like half of a conversation. I don't have any problem at all with somebody saying I prefer to think they're from the 2nd century or late 1st century. Okay. The simple question I would have for these good friends or colleagues, what problems in the letters would that hypothesis better explain? All right, that's a historian's question. Mm-hmm. What is better explained by that hypothesis? So I'm going to try to explain what I mean. Leaving aside Romans, because Paul hadn't met these people and he's doing a whole strange thing in Romans. It's a kind of weird letter. But the other 6, I would argue, are half conversations. They assume the recipient's knowledge of circumstances, and therefore they're difficult, I think, to explain as fabrications. Even in the New Testament, there's already this letter, probably not by Peter, call it 2 Peter, in which the guy says, now Paul wrote to you according to the wisdom given to him. There are some real head scratchers in those letters, which the ignorant and unstable twist to their own destruction. So what this guy's saying is, Paul, now we think he was authoritative, but can't make sense of a lot of what's in his letters. Why? Well, because let's look at some of the things that are in them. So in 1 Thessalonians, 2 Corinthians, you have him saying things like, what are you asking me for? I have nothing to say about that. I already told you what I know. Or he says, the one who offended me in my visit, he knows what's going on. Now we've made friends. Let's repair the friendship. 2 Corinthians, after this painful visit I had, let's get this collection going again. Please give. Now he's got you, Derek. You're inviting, super chats and Patreon. Paul, he had you beat, man.
I can't compete with that guy.
2 Corinthians 8 and 9 is amazing. So in 2 Corinthians 1-7, as you know, he's been pleading to get back after this painful visit that he had, to restore, everything's about we're friends, consolation. And he says, now we really need to get this collection going again. And I tell you what, I already told the people of the north in Macedonia, I told them that you were giving a lot, and that's what spurred them to give a lot. So now, if you don't give a lot, I'm going to be embarrassed, because I told, that's why they gave a lot, because you gave a lot. So now I need you to give a lot to, say. So and then he says, and don't worry about the safety of the money. This is money that's going to be conveyed to Jerusalem. I'll tell you, the Titus and the brother you can trust, they're going to take it. So it's all safe. Like, it's not just in my hands. Right? So you can trust. So the question is, what's going on? I mean, if that were a fabricated letter, how do you explain that? Who's giving the money to whom? If there's no real Paul going to Jerusalem to deal with Jesus' students there, things like that. So 1 Corinthians, Chloe's people. Paul changes his mind in the middle of the sentence. He says very confidently, look, there are factions there. Some people say you belong to me. Some people say you belong to Apollos. Look, nobody belongs to me. I didn't baptize anybody at all. Oh, wait a minute. I did baptize the house of Stephanus. Yes, I did. Okay. But apart from the house of Stephanus, I didn't baptize anybody. How do you explain that if it's not the fact that Stephanus is actually sitting right with him, because he says that at the end of the letter, and Paul says, I didn't baptize any of you, and Stephanus, excuse me, Paul, actually you did. I did baptize the house of Stephanus, but nobody else. And then he goes on to say, Apollos is building on my foundation, and what do you want me to come? How do you explain all of this, right? If these are fabricated letters. In 1 Thessalonians, 1 Corinthians, halfway through the letter, he's going to the issues they wrote about, right? And he quotes their statements back to them. Philippians, watch out for the dogs. 2 Corinthians, these people claim to be super apostles. Why didn't you stick up for me? Paul loses it. He becomes angry and incoherent. I'm talking like a madman. Why? Well, you get the idea, right? What I'm trying to say is, a lot of this stuff, in my view, only really makes sense as half of a conversation.
And this isn't just an argument from embarrassment. I did a show just the other day before yesterday with another guy. He's actually got a PhD in philosophy, so he's not a historian in the same respect that you are. But, we were talking about, like, was there a real Paul? Because that was the real title of his particular show with me. Huh. And you really need a very good reason to think there wasn't. And so with what we looked at with these letters and stuff, just kind of considering this, it's like, this isn't just arguments from embarrassment that one could argue and say, oh, that's proof that there's a real guy. Because sometimes in the ancient world, it's not embarrassing like it is today. It's hard to find, is that embarrassing to them there at that time or now? But what you're talking about, like half conversations, who's going to forge and create these complete half conversations for what reason? And like, what's more plausible to me? What makes more sense? We could come up with any idea. I mean, you can create anything you want if you really want to bad enough believe in something, but what makes the most sense? We do have a super chat. I don't know if you want to take it real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's from that guy that always likes to give us a hard time.
Yeah, please.
It's Ben. He's a good friend. He always has clever, very thoughtful questions. So can you elaborate? And I don't know if you're going to do this. Maybe this is a question we can get into, but can you elaborate Christianity's spread before Paul, particularly among Gentiles, as he's often seen as the apostle to the Gentile world? He's asking you to go into the dark space where we don't have much written at all or anything written, like the spread of Christianity among Gentiles, though. It's like,
I'll give a quick answer, and then I'll give the rest of our talk together as the full answer. Okay.
Okay.
So Ben, the quick answer is that as far as Paul's concerned, he, in my view, as I read him, he's the one who got this unique call to go to Gentiles. As far as he's concerned, he doesn't know anything about the book of Acts. The book of Acts will introduce a different idea, right? Saying that it was already Peter. Peter was told in Acts chapter 10, go to Cornelius and all of that stuff. So Acts has a whole different scheme. But if you're just looking at Paul's letters, and this is another reason why I think it's better to view them as primary sources, because they completely contradict the book of Acts in many, many cases. So Acts makes better sense as a later effort to homogenize everything and smooth out the rough edges.
Peter and Paul are best buds, and they're
exactly.
both to the Gentiles.
Exactly.
Yeah. Which makes me wonder too, I like your answer, but I do wonder, like Ben's question, like, could Peter have initially been a guy who was trying to go after Paul's Gentiles, and this Acts is trying to make them actually friends, and Paul saying, no, I'm the one appointed this task, get off my territory, because somebody's trying to convert Paul's people to circumcision. So we have to try and wonder what is going on there. But anyway, sorry.
No, I actually think that's pretty much right, what you just said. True that. So we're not talking here about an obvious truth. I'm not making a big assumption here. This isn't from dogma. It's just that I don't find the fabrication hypothesis helpful. So I'm going to try to show the value of this other hypothesis. Not that anybody should buy it. I'm just trying to articulate it. That's all.
How much are you selling it for is the real question.
And then this question, I want to come back to this point that what started it all is where we want to end up, but probably not in today's session, maybe a little bit more in the next session when we look at the second generation. Then we can come back. But you really, because Jesus didn't, well, if he wrote anything, if he existed, he wrote in the sand, in that passage in John chapter 8 that doesn't belong in John. The woman taken in adultery, he wrote something in the sand. That's the only thing we know or we hear about that he wrote. And that doesn't exist anymore. So we have absolutely no idea what he was about, except to try to hypothesize what started all of this. So if he existed, Jesus lived around here and moved around here in these, especially beautiful countryside, Galilee. So Galilee, for those who are not familiar with biblical geography or Eastern geography, there's on the right side the so-called Sea of Galilee, is just a lake, and then the Mediterranean over here. And Galilee is this area here. And it's really just that the yellow lines are the roads. So Josephus, the rabbis and other writers don't mention the towns that the New Testament, the Gospels, put Jesus in. So Chorazin, Bethsaida, well, Bethsaida Josephus does mention, but little places, Nazareth, right? They're not mentioned mostly in other texts, whereas the Gospels don't mention the major towns, which are Sepphoris, Tiberias, Gabra, Tarichea, Giscala. These don't turn up in the Gospels, but even in Galilee, little Galilee, these are the major towns. So Sepphoris here, Tiberias over here. They're not, Tarichea there. They're not mentioned in the Gospels. Quite strange, right? So here's another shot around Tiberias, and Jesus is working on the north side of this lake in these little villages. That's like a typical boat on the lake. But Nazareth was just this little town 3 miles away from the major town, the major city of Sepphoris. But it's not mentioned in other sources of the time. I think it first comes up in a 3rd century inscription, Natsrat in Hebrew. It's just not mentioned. So the strange thing is that Sepphoris today, which was this amazing town, is just an archaeological site. It's a beautiful archaeological site, mainly from the 2nd, 3rd century remains. Whereas Nazareth, which was a little hole in the ground in the first century and not mentioned by anybody, is a sprawling town because of the Jesus story about it. That's the main reason why it grew up as a Christian town. Whereas Paul, the reason I say all that is, of course, to make the basic but important point that Paul is not interested in any of that stuff. He did not know Jesus. He admits, didn't know him. He admits he's not one of the original so-called apostles. He wasn't one of his students. And he goes around proclaiming mainly not his teachings, but his saving death, resurrection, and return. He also knows a few stories about Jesus' life, which he mentions in 1 Corinthians, for example, the Last Supper. He's heard some stories, but that's not the center of what he wants to talk about. He not only avoids Galilee, but all villages, and he goes only to these major centers. That's where Paul likes to be, in the big cities of the Eastern Empire. So it's a curious thing that in Romans, the last of the letters that looks to be genuine, in my view, he says, I've done everything I can in the Eastern Mediterranean. There's no more room for any work here for me. I've got to go to the West. And you think to yourself, well, gosh, I mean, Jesus spent his whole time just in the little bit of Galilee. But that's not Paul's, that's not how he rolls. So Paul, I want to use Paul as a window into the first generation and pick up, Derek, on what you and Ben were asking about and what you were talking about, Ben was asking about, this whole thing with Peter and others. And that's what we want to get into now. Because what you notice, if you start to read Paul's letters in chronological order, especially beginning with 1 Thessalonians, is that he keeps coming back to this term, which I want to translate differently from how it's usually translated. So the term in Greek is to euangelion, and it's usually translated as gospel, right? And the problem with gospel, do you know, Derek, from your time in the church, how did people usually explain gospel? What did they say it meant?
Good news.
Good news, right? Yeah. Okay. So the problem with translating it as good news or gospel is it suggests everybody shared this. I mean, who doesn't like good news, right? So the idea is the gospel is something shared by all early Christians. What I want to suggest to you is that's not the case at all. And that's why I'd rather translate it as other than gospel or good news. The word itself really just means the announcement of some kind. So I'm going to call it the announcement because I want to suggest it's Paul's term. And other people were kind of allergic to it. The people who didn't like Paul among the early Christians were not into the announcement because that's Paul's thing. Mm-hmm. Let me explain what I mean. 1 Thessalonians, earliest text known. How do we know that? Well, because when he writes Philippians later to the Philippians, he says to these people that you shared in the announcement from the first day until now. When was the first day? He goes on to say, in the early days of the announcement, when I left Macedonia. Well, that's exactly when 1 Thessalonians was written. And Paul calls that the beginning of the announcement, right? So, and the announcement is the beginning of his mission. So this bears on Ben's question, right? Paul sees himself as having this special thing called the euangelion, the announcement from God, this message I got from God, and he's the only one who has it. So 1 Thessalonians is fantastic because it's almost neglected, right? In, I don't know, New Testament theology, church stuff. It's very much neglected, but it's really, really important because it shows us Paul in his element. He's not yet disturbed by other Christ followers who are attacking him and forcing him to respond. He's just saying what he thinks is his announcement is about. And 6 times in this little 4-page letter, he uses this term. It's about the special announcement and the reactions to it. So what was his announcement? Well, this word could be translated different ways. So I want to forget about the gospel as a translation. Could be the welcome dispatch, the reliable report, the faithfully conveyed message, the news we've been awaiting. I'm going to go with the announcement here. It's very strange history. It's not found before Christian texts. So the root is found, but not this form, to euangelion. The adjective is fairly common. It's used of the god Hermes. Because he's the faithful messenger. So he's called the euangelos, the faithful messenger of Zeus and the other gods. You can rely on Hermes to deliver your message, right? He's always shown with the little wings on his feet and his hat. He goes around delivering messages, but it's not always good news. The point about it is it's reliable news. It's true. You can count on it. It's faithfully reported. It could be the report of somebody's death or a loss in a war, but it's true. In tragedy, the term is used for the news that we're awaiting from Troy, right? From the battlefield of Troy. We're waiting this specific piece of news. But it's not taught evangelion. It's not that. Sorry, that's a neuter adjective, right? It's not with an adjective. It's not adjective article. It's not with an article. It's just an adjective used of Hermes, or it is a without the definite article used of a piece of news, right? So an awaited report would be a evangelion.
May I have just something interesting about this whole evangelion and how this is not mentioned prior, except in Greek, the roots in the Greek idea here of Hermes, and it's Zeus and other gods. Yes, Acts, like we talked about, contradicts Paul, but I wonder if there's like a remnant there of reality in some sense, because Paul in Acts 17 at the Areopagus quotes, and he does it twice, once in Titus, but of course also in Acts, he quotes Epimenides, the Cretan, to kind of like lay out this, what I like to think is different. It's not what you would think. It doesn't sound like something a Jew in any Second Temple literature is doing, but he knows this Second Temple literature, which is what makes it funny. But he's out here talking, you are all the creation or children of the creator. And it's like, hold on, that's Zeus. Like, what are you doing? You're using it. It's interesting. Anyway.
Yeah. And you remember in Acts that Paul and Barnabas are taken to be Greek gods, right? And people start worshiping and they say, don't worship us. I mean, Acts has some really interesting plays like that. I agree. That's another subject. I had to say it because when you mentioned how you're interpreting that term and where it comes from, it ties into the pagan world all too well. So the point is that all of a sudden, especially in Paul's letters, but in the New Testament generally, it explodes. So you have 76 occurrences of this word. 60 of them are in letters attributed to Paul. 6 of them are in Mark. And that's why I'm focusing on Mark in our next discussion, because what I want to suggest is that Mark is a Pauline interpretation of Jesus' life, which other gospel writers absolutely reject, right? They take over Mark's material, but they absolutely refashion it because they don't like this interpretation of Jesus at all. So that's for next time. But already here, 66 of the 76 are in Paul-ish. That is, Paul and those who claim to be Paul are also using this term, and Mark. So most of the new. So that, what does that mean? It means that Matthew never uses the term unqualified. He never speaks of euangelion, even though Mark does, and he's using Mark. So he changes it to make it the announcement of the reign of heaven, Ooh. Right? Which is different from just saying the announcement, right? Whereas Luke and John omit the word altogether. They will not use it. And that's, to me, really, really interesting, because it shows that they're allergic to the term. They don't like it. They don't care for Paul's approach to these things. Now, the third generation Clement, Ignatius, Didache, Barnabas, Diognetus, well, that's fourth, fifth generation as well, Polycarp, use it often. Like these guys use it frequently, and they use it in what you might call a Catholic way, right? Trying to bring everybody together. They even use it for the texts. They even start to use it for a given text like Matthew, calling it the gospel. So this is now, you can see the beginnings in the third, fourth, fifth generation of how this term comes to be a general Christian term. But what I'm trying to argue is that in the first and second generations, everybody knew that was not the case. It was a Pauline term. So what needs explaining is, why does Paul use this so often? The second generation, why Mark has such an investment in the term, but everybody else rejects it. And then the third generation, why everybody's starting to use it. That's why I want to translate it as the announcement, so it doesn't sound too familiar, as it's not just good news. Right. It's actually bad news for the Christ followers who disagreed with Paul. And Paul says they're going to hell. And they say the same thing, presumably, about him. So this is like a serious conflict in the first generation. And we need to try to understand why. Here's the so-called Via Egnatia, right? The highway across the north of Greece. Paul, this is what remains of it today, little stretches of it. So it's not a highway like, Highway 1 or Highway 95 or something, I-95. It's like this. It's a Roman highway, which is what they call paved with stones and a kind of curbs along the side. But, quite impressive as a main thoroughfare across the north of Greece. And then you would travel from Dyrrhachium to Brundisium and then go up the Appian way to Rome, across the sea. So Paul, when we first meet him, is traveling there. He stops at Philippi. Remember, he wrote to the Philippians, you were there at the beginning of the announcement. And then when we read First Thessalonians, he's already gone there, and he's traveled down to Athens, and then he's writing from Corinth. And what happens is he sends Timothy back with a letter to them to see that they're doing okay. So he hangs out in the south. He sends Timothy back, and Timothy has come back to him with another letter from the Thessalonians. That's the situation. And that's why we have half of a conversation here in this letter. So Paul's very first summary in the world, this is like the beginning of Christianity. It's the first Christian text we have. And it says this: we know, brothers beloved by God, that he's chosen you because the announcement of ours came to you not in word only, but also in power and spirit. The word of the Lord has reverberated from you not only in Macedonia, the north of Greece, and Achaia, the south, but everybody reports what our coming to you was like, how you turned to God from idols to serve a living and true God, to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, Jesus, who rescues us from the wrath, the anger that is coming. That's his summary of the announcement. And this is amazing because it's uncluttered by all the later, bullshit that will come up when he's got to defend himself against other people, reformulate it all. So basically what he's saying here, again, going with the visual thing, is Christ died and rose and went up to heaven, and he's soon going to return. You all need to trust him. Turn from idols. That's what you've done. Namely, the gods you used to worship, right? The gods of Thessalonica, the Dioscuri, the Castor and Pollux, worshiping Zeus. You've given that up. You're waiting for him to return. In the meantime, you're living blamelessly so that you can be evacuated when the wrath hits the fan in the near future.
I love the visuals.
Oh, thank you. I have enormous fun making this stuff up. But
isn't there a problem in the Thessalonian church too that peeps us into the reality? They're freaking out because some of their members are dying, and Paul made a promise. When did he make that promise to them that you think?
Yeah, well, exactly. He gave exactly. I'm glad you asked the question there. He gave the impression that this was going to happen really, really soon. And so the letter that comes back with Timothy, right, asks the question, apparently, when's this going to happen? What about, it's not necessarily the case that somebody's died already, but at least someone's either on the verge of dying or sick, or somebody thinks, well, wait a minute, this is taking longer than, what about the people, my parents are getting old or whatever. What's going to happen?
Real quick, I
yeah.
got to give a shout out to my friend Normalizing Atheism. He has a YouTube channel, ladies and gentlemen, where being someone who's a skeptic, wherever you're at, he has a community there of believers and non-believers, but really good friend of mine. He just started this channel not too long ago. Go help support him. Thank you for the super chat and the happy birthdays, everyone. I really do appreciate it. And I love learning this stuff with you and hearing the different views, like the arguments that go on in the comment section. And like, it's really cool to hear different people have different thoughts. And I'm listening to the scholar trying to learn. So that I ask everyone to try and maybe consider what you do say, even if you disagree, but have good reasons why. Bring your punches. Let's get in the ring and let's hear what you say. But I want to hear what you have to say, because honestly, I don't know all these things, Dr. Mason. So that's why I bring you on. But go subscribe to his channel. Pastor Mike is his name. Pasta, just like that. Just think like that. Not pasta, pasta. And thanks a lot, man. And also, excuse me, but thank you for the super chat. I really appreciate it. Here's my offering for church this morning. Yeah, because it's Sunday today. So thank you guys. Really go check them out. Subscribe to his channel, though, and help support what he does. He's a good friend of mine. Thank you for the super chat again. I apologize for interrupting Dr. Mason. He's a really good friend of mine, and every time he pops in, I'm trying to help him grow that community because I really believe in what he's doing. And, people box me out. I don't believe like them. I am like the situation you're describing right now. I have a total different take on life, and I'm trying to analyze it from a natural point of view, but I'm going to cook in this place forever because I don't believe like them. So it's about having a community that can bring different thoughts, and come on in. We welcome you as you are. There's no threat.
Yeah, great. No. Hey, don't apologize. It's fine. And I'm really pleased. I should tell the viewers, I can't see the comments that are coming in just because I've got the full screen open here.
Right.
And I need to focus on that, but I do see the comments later.
I'm going to hold another super chat, though, on Acts when you're ready, because we're going to do a Luke Acts episode. I wanted them to know in the future, really addressing the we part of Acts. But at the end of the show, I do have a super chat. If we don't touch it during your presentation, we will get it at the end. John, thank you for that super chat. I wanted to publicly say that. So
the methodological point I want to make here is all I'm doing. I'm not claiming to know a lot of stuff here. What I'm doing is just we're looking at this letter, right? So yeah, it's a hypothesis that this is by Paul and it's early. So I've already made that clear. That's my working hypothesis. But now the question is interpreting it. We're looking at it, right? It's right here. So I'm not making up this stuff about, the end is coming soon. You're waiting for him to return from heaven. That's what Paul said, right? Mm-hmm. So that's what we're trying to do, is make sense of this little letter. It's his first letter, and it's a tremendously rich, right? Because he's able to say here, this is a group he's just met, and he's established them, and they've already sent a letter back with Timothy saying, hey, wait a minute. And now he's writing back to them, right? So he sent Timothy back again with this letter to them. Because remember, there's no postal service in the ancient world. You may think that there's no postal service now sometimes. It's not that good, but maybe depends where you live. But in the ancient world, there actually wasn't a postal service. So you had to write with people who you knew were going someplace, right? Unless you had access to the official government line for communication. So here's what he writes. So he says, this is what I told you. Everybody heard this, that you're all waiting for Christ's return, right? Then he says, now, you know that our coming to you was not futile. After already being abused at Philippi, right? The previous stop on the highway. As you know, we spoke with bold confidence to tell you the announcement of God, though with much struggle. Our consolation doesn't come from deceit or impure motives. So he's already defending himself here against the charges that got him kicked out of Thessalonica. He says that we were abused at Philippi, right? So we went along the road to you, and now we left you. But don't be thinking that we deceived you or had impure motives or trickery. Now, why would this issue even come up? He says, you know that we were entrusted with the announcement, right? To speak, not to please human beings. You know our exertion and our hardship. We labored night and day so as not to burden any of you. We proclaim the announcement of God. So remember, he keeps saying, the announcement, that's what we told you, this announcement that Christ's coming back. Why does he say this, do you think? Derek, do you have any ideas?
I don't, actually. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this because...
Okay. Well, it looks like, look at what he's defending himself against. Who might say that, hey, this guy deceived you and tricked you? And why would he say, we worked night and day so as not to burden any of you? So what would be the accusation that would bring that response from him?
I think it's money, probably.
Yeah.
Because he says in 1 Corinthians 9, if I'm not mistaken,
Yeah.
He's trying to make an argument. Oh, well, the other apostles, they get paid for their labor. Yeah. Me and Barnabas, we can't. What the heck's wrong with you guys? So I think that would be the reason.
Yeah. So because this is half of a conversation, right? That's the point. We don't know it's not obvious. We have to think about it. We have to stare at this a little bit and think, okay, what would have elicited, we're listening to half of a telephone conversation here. What would have elicited this response from him? And I think you're right. I think the obvious charge is, hey, Paul, or maybe they didn't write it in a letter. Maybe they just all know that he got kicked out of town because he was accused of being a deceiver. Why would he be accused of that? Because he rolls into town and says, hey, if you believe what I'm saying, you will be evacuated to heaven in the clouds soon, right? And so the good people of Thessalonica say, come on, this guy has flattered you, right? He's tricked you. He must have had a motive to do that. What's the obvious motive? Money. Did he take your money? So he tricked you and took your money, and he split town, never to be seen again.
It is interesting too. Corinthians, he's saying the money, right? And why are we not allowed? But then turns around and says, but I don't want your money. And then he's playing some type of game, in my opinion. I don't know. It's like,
well, the other funny thing is that he says to the Philippians, nobody entered into giving to me at the beginning of the announcement except you. So that means they did give to him, actually. So he began in Philippi. He did get money because he says later in the letter to the Philippians, nobody else gave me anything, but you did. You were very generous. You gave me a lot. And then I went on. Well, then he went on to Thessalonica. So you can understand what Philippi was a Roman military colony, right? So this is a tough place. And he says he was beaten up, suffering and abused in Philippi. He fled. He went on to Thessalonica, and then he leaves and he's accused of being a trickster, deceiving the gullible, and taking their money. Well, he can say, hey, that we didn't take your money. We worked night and day so that we wouldn't have to ask you for money. We took care of ourselves, but we already know that he got money from Philippi. So that could at least feed the image that he has. But notice that I've highlighted it here in dark blue. He keeps saying, what we brought to you was the announcement, right? He keeps coming back to this repeatedly. What was the announcement? He recalls it in verse 12 here, urging and encouraging you and pleading that you lead a life worthy of God who calls you into his kingdom and glory. He's about to take you up into heaven. So now, after 2 chapters of that, getting rid of the accusations against him, he says, when we could bear it no longer, we decided to be left alone in Athens, that is in the south, and we sent Timothy, our brother and collaborator, in proclaiming the announcement, right, to strengthen and encourage you so that no one would be shaken by these sufferings. So he knows that not only was he accused of being a trickster, he knows that the poor folks he left behind who trusted what he said, they're getting dissed and abused and ridiculed and who knows what by their fellow citizens, right?
That's what I was going to say. Like Paula Fredrickson kind of talks about this dilemma with the gods that run in the blood.
Yeah.
And I think it's really interesting because can you imagine how ostracized they must have felt being pagans, neglecting their gods, their local deities, and accepting this? They're getting persecuted in some way, even if it's just mocked and scorned. Thank you, Jordan Bickett, for the super chat. Happy birthday, brother. Fascinating presentation, Dr. Mason. I think so, too. I always enjoy you coming on. I don't care what day or what time it is. You're always welcome, Dr. Mason. And real quick, shout out to my friend Suicide Dropkick. I didn't want to interrupt you earlier. Thank you so much. He says, my big guns as a skeptic are I don't believe in magic or Santa anymore. I don't feel I need any more than that. Happy birthday. Thank you so much, my friend. Sorry. So yeah, I
totally agree with that. No Santa and so on. So what we're doing here is not about belief, right? It's about trying to understand the roots of Western culture. That's it, really. Where did all this come from? How did Christianity, which has had such an enormous effect in the West for 2,000 years, where did it come from? How did it begin? And what we're looking at here, I mean, it's, I think, amazing. It's a translation. It's my translation, but it's the earliest writing by a Christ follower that we have. So we're just trying to make sense of it, right?
Real quick question on this.
Yeah.
Paul, where do you think Paul's going? I know it says in Acts he goes to the synagogue, as it was supposed custom for him. Are these pagans at synagogues in the diaspora in Rome, do you think? Where are these locations that you think Paul's going to, or we don't know?
Well, we have a little bit of a clue when he keeps talking about how he works. He works and works wherever he goes. He supports himself through his work. Now, in Acts, which, we shouldn't just simply trust, its chronology is all difficult to square with Paul's letters, and it's a big problem. But it does say that he was it's usually translated as tent maker, but it could be, it's more like a leather worker. It could be an awning maker or, just somebody who works in material. He's a tradesman. He's got a trade. So the easiest thing, in Acts, it says that's how he got with Prisca and Aquila, right? He meets various people through his trade guild. So I think that's the simplest explanation. In each town, each city, you have trade guilds. And if he's coming into town and working for a living, as he's proclaiming this announcement, it stands to reason he would do what he's good at, right? Capable of doing. But that might also get up the back of the people who are already in the guild. They wouldn't necessarily welcome a new member. It's not clear how he cracked a voluntary association that was like a club of these members, or maybe he was freelancing on the side and they really didn't like that either. There's all kinds of possibilities.
Okay.
But I don't think we need to bring the synagogue into this, except that in 2 Corinthians 11, he will say that he kept getting beaten up in the synagogue, or by Jews at least. So whatever town he would go into, the Jews really didn't like him. So that's already interesting and important. He's saying some stuff that the Jews don't like. And we're going to come to that in just 1 second about what that might be. But it helps to illuminate the problems in early Christianity, right?
Thank you.
Yeah. So he says, even when we were with you, we predicted to you that we were going to suffer distress, just as happened. And right? So we know that you're suffering there, and you know that we're suffering there. But now Timothy has come to us from you and reported to us your trust and love. Hallelujah. It's good. So what this letter is basically Paul concerned that this group he left back in Thessalonica is just going to defect, right? Because they're getting hassled by everybody around them who think they're foolish, gullible. Paul was a trickster and a charlatan, and they gave him money. And so Paul sends Timothy back. Now he's heard back from them. He says, wow, what a relief. Fantastic. So that's basically the letter, except that the latter half of the letter is now Paul responding to their questions. And again, this is what I mean by one half of a conversation, right? Because he begins these with a little formula in Greek. I didn't write it out here, but it's just now concerning. In English, we would say now concerning this, now concerning that, now concerning the next thing. And what that formula is in Greek, it's peri de, now about. And it's just a series of things. Now about those who die, right? Now about what you should do. Well, this means he's responding to their questions, right? Because he just takes them up one after the other. They're all disjointed. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, he uses the same phrase when he says, now concerning the things you wrote about. And he takes them up in a sequence. So we know that this is what he's doing. So here's what he says. The first question he responds to is, now, well, you learned from us how to please God. Just keep doing it. You know what instructions we gave you. So this already suggests that they've asked him, what should we do while we're waiting for Christ to return, right? Like, how are we supposed to conduct ourselves? And he says, well, I can't tell you any more than I already told you. This is the will of God, that you're holy and holy enough to go up into heaven. And how do you arrange that? Well, you abstain from this Greek word porneia. So he's particularly concerned about sex, physical enmeshment in the physical world, right? That's going to drag you down and keep you from going up. And porneia, especially sex, kind of, sins, not just sex within marriage, but anyway, you got to control your vessel. Now, I would suggest, I'm not the first one to suggest it, that this is a euphemism for, sex organs. Each one of you has to know how to control your vessel. Keep it in your, in your tunic or your pants. These guys aren't. I was going to say that they're not wearing pants or togas. I was going to say keep it in your toga, but they're not wearing togas. Same thing,
just anachronistic. Yeah.
So control your vessel, right? So that's actually quite interesting because he's envisioning this movement up into the sky. And the second century philosopher Celsus will make great fun of this and say, look, the sky is for birds, the earth is for animals, the sea is for fish, right? People don't belong in the sky. So these letters from Paul will be ridiculed later by Greek philosophers. And Paul's already somehow aware of the issue, because when he comes to 1 Corinthians, he's going to say, well, how is this going to happen? I'll tell you a secret. I'll tell you a mystery, he says in 1 Corinthians 15. We're not all going to die. When Christ returns, those of us who are alive will be transformed and made into spirits so that we can go up into heaven, right? Because you need to be a spirit to do that.
So this gets into, and we kind of jabbing into the Corinthian concept of the resurrection here. But let me say real quick, Adrian, thank you for the super chat. I appreciate the love. He says, I suspect If I could go back in time and hear Paul talking to people, I would see a big time bullshitter.
You would be like the good people of Thessalonica and Philippi, who said exactly that, right? And therefore drove him out of town. Because remember, these are quite small cities. So when somebody comes into this little walled city and starts to, talk to people in the marketplace and stir up, anticipations, word gets around, and people get alarmed and say, "Come on, get this guy out of town. He's a disturber. He's a bullshitter." Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what happened. The second question, therefore, so all of these questions have basically the same theme. And what they do is they reinforce the urgency, the imminence with which Paul said Christ will return. Because the first question is, well, what are we supposed to do in the meantime? And Paul says, I already told you, I can't tell you anymore. This is the will of God. Just like keep pure, right? Be made holy so you can go up into heaven. That's it. Second thing, this is the question you raised before, Derek. What about those who may die before Christ returns? Well, he says 4:13 before I started quoting, don't worry about it. It's not like they have no hope when they die. Why? The Lord himself will descend from heaven. So this is exactly how it's going to play out. The archangel will give a call. There will be a trumpet sound. The dead, anybody who's died in Christ, that is, following Christ, will rise first. Then we who are alive. So notice, that's how imminent it is. I mean, he expects we to be alive, right? We will all be caught up in the clouds together to meet the Lord in the air. So don't worry, right? Those who have died, actually, they're going first. So they're going to be raised up first.
That's a sneak. I feel like he's improvising. I feel like he's like creating this as he goes along, because here is a problem he didn't really address or ever let them know. That's why they're going, look, Bob just died. Tiffany just died. What is going on, man? You said we were all going to go and meet the Lord in the sky. And here he is. Oh, well, don't worry. The dead are going to go first. They're the lucky ones.
Right.
And he seems to think he's going to remain and be alive at the coming. But what happens when Paul dies? Who's going to say, hold on, dude, weren't you supposed to be alive? I had a pastor at a church that actually said she had a vision and the Lord told her that he was going to come back during her life. Like she was going to see it. Of course, she's dead now. She was an older woman, but she's long gone. What do you do with that? I mean, what do? You keep respinning the same old thing, and that's what I see happening. But anyway,
this is exactly what Celsus already, in this Greek philosopher in the 2nd century, and then Porphyry, if it depends on what Porphyry actually wrote, and Julian, the emperor in the 4th century, they will all pick on this kind of stuff and say Paul clearly said he would be alive when Christ returned, and clearly he's not. So what's going on there? Their third question is basically a version of the same thing, right? So the first question was, what are we supposed to do in the meantime? Hey, what about those who died? This is like taking a long time here. We're ready for Christ to return. When's it going to happen? And then their third question is apparently simply flat out, when is it going to happen, actually? Because his answer is, look at his answer, now concerning. So each of these, I didn't include all because it'd be too much, but each of these began with a now concerning, right? Now concerning the times and the seasons. Well, you already know. I don't have anything more to say. I told you when I was with you, you know that the day of the Lord's coming like a thief in the night. So just be ready. God did not assign us for wrath, anger, right? We're not going to be around when that happens. We're going to have security through being taken up into heaven. So he's not answering the question, just saying, look, I don't know, but it's going to be soon. And he closes the letter. This is his final wish for them. So it's a short letter. May the God of peace himself make you completely holy. May your spirit be sound, your body and mind be preserved in a blameless condition at the arrival of our Lord Jesus Christ. The one summoning you to heaven is trustworthy. He will do it. Right? I mean, it seems to me that's a very telling way to end the letter, right? Because their questions have all been about, yes, we told Timothy we're still with you. And Paul's saying, that's fantastic. I'm really pleased. But their questions are, when? Like, how long do we have to keep doing this stuff? And what happens with people who die? And his final assurance is, hey, it's going to happen. He will do it. Just keep yourselves blameless. Right?
That's the one message that continues regardless of forgery, everything you can imagine. Second Peter's really good at that. Day, 1,000 years, 1,000 years a day.
Yeah.
He will do it. We aren't sure when. It could be thousands of years from now.
Yeah.
He will, and it just keeps going. So that's one message, that when all the first guys are no longer seen, no matter what generation of Christianity, you're going to see he will. It's just they stop talking about it as much as time goes by. They're like, let's stop. This is a sore spot. So,
but what's really distinctive, you're exactly right. What's really distinctive in the first generation is that Paul is not saying could be 1,000 years, right?
Right.
He's very clearly saying, we who are alive, not all of us will die. So first of it, in First Thessalonians, is maybe some will die. No worries, they will go first. In First Corinthians already, it's not all of us will die. Right? So it's like some will definitely die, but not all of us. Those who remain will be caught up. So to summarize this letter and why I think it's such a fascinating little text, it's clear, right, what Paul is about. This is what Paul's announcement is. Christ died, rose, will return. It's simple, just absolutely simple. The Thessalonians' concerns, how long, when? Is this really going to happen? But notice here, there's nothing about Judean law, nothing about Jewish customs, circumcision. Like, these are Gentiles. These are people in Thessalonica. So you asked about, did he go to the synagogue? I don't think there's any reason in his letters here to think that he deliberately went to the synagogue. But the people in the synagogue might have not been happy that a Jewish guy is going around saying this stuff, right? But it doesn't require Jewish knowledge, right? To become a Christ follower, this is the point. It doesn't require any knowledge of the Bible, of, Moses, the prophets, nothing. There's nothing like that in Paul's letters. But he does mention the Jews. And he mentions it in this context when he's saying, you all got, you suffered from your townsfolk the same thing that Christ followers in Judea suffered from the Judeans, the Jews. Mm-hmm. Look at what he says about them, who killed the Lord Jesus and the prophets and drove us out and displease God and oppose all human beings, by hindering us from talking to the Gentiles so that they might be rescued. In all this, constantly filling up the measure of their sins. But God's anger has finally overtaken them. We don't know what he's referring to there. Could be the famine of the 40s. It could be Gaius Caligula's effort to put a statue in the temple in 39. It could be anything. We don't know. But he's referring, or it could be nothing. None of those things. He's just saying, God's really angry with them. But this is really interesting, right? So here's Paul, who is a Jew by birth, but he's making very clear already his complete distance from the Jews as a group who killed the Lord Jesus and the prophets and drove us out and oppose all humanity, and they oppose Paul's mission. So already here in his first letter, even though it's got nothing, it doesn't require any Jewish knowledge. It's at odds with them.
Real quick, I want to make note, and I have a couple super chats. I might have to get your guys' super chats toward the end, but Adrian just dropped one too, so I got to find out. I'll ask you, and then we probably get to it to the end. But in that particular passage where it talks about the wrath being filled up, the cup is being full, like it's about to come down, some argue that's interpolation, because they think that sounds too much like Jews are going to get the wrath in the temple and the 70 AD ordeal. And then some say, no, I mean, like you said, there could be multiple meanings here in this particular passage, and it doesn't necessarily require that. I mean, they get kicked out of the land too. So a lot of the Jews in the regions that Paul is in Rome, they get kicked out of Rome. I mean, so this could play a part into the historical situation of why Jews got kicked out in this time frame, and that might play a role. I don't know how that fits wrath, but I don't know. Anyway, real quick, Adrian asks, and I've got other super chats we will get to the end. This has to do with Paul believing in a physical resurrection, or is it just spirit bodies in heaven, things like that? Since you brought up 1 Thessalonians, do we want to wait to get into that a little?
Very quick answers, and then we'll get into it a little bit. But very quick response. He changes his mind about the body. It's clear in 1 Thessalonians, I think, that these are people who die and then go up to heaven. He just doesn't clarify it, right? We will be caught up in the clouds, just like that. 1 Corinthians, which is what your question is about, I think, 1 Corinthians 15, he's dealing with people of his own followers who have been influenced by other teachers who now say this is all nonsense, this idea of bodies going up into heaven. And he's saying, oh, you thought I meant bodies going up into no, it's spirits. All right. So I think, Derek, you said he's making it up as he goes along. I think that's right. That's my short answer. I think that he will change his tune. And 2 Corinthians, he changes even more to different ideas. Today, we don't have time to go into all of that. I want to try to keep a focus on the conflicts with other.
Yeah, I apologize.
No, don't apologize. It's good. These are great.
Well, I appreciate
I want to try to answer them as well as I can. But
yeah, and we'll get into. I'll ask your question at the end again, Adrian. I'm screenshotting your guys' super chats. We've got 2 other ones on top of that, but about Jesus' physical resurrection, what he thought about that as well, and we'll get into that. So thank you for the super chat for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really interesting question. Really interesting. On the interpolation thing, there was a period in the 70s, 80s, 90s when scholars were leaning toward the interpolation idea. But I think in recent years, people have come to realize that was like an ecumenical move more than a historical one. That is to say, this is not a nice thing to say about the Jews. Let's say it's an interpolation. I mean, it doesn't sound very Christian. And it would be nice, it would fit if it came after 70. Yeah, it would fit after 70, but it would also fit in 39, 40, 45,
especially
48.
Paul's getting beat up by them every time he goes to.
Yeah. So there's no historical reason to think it doesn't fit in the letter. All the manuscripts have it, for example, and we have a ton of manuscripts for early Christian texts because they were copied so frequently. So all the there's no manuscript issue with it, unlike some passages that clearly aren't in, like that woman taken in adultery in John 8. That's not in the best manuscripts of John. So there you have an issue. Here, there's no issue, I would say, except, people's feelings being hurt. So 1 Thessalonians, the fantastic thing about it is it's just Paul on his own, right? He's just kind of sailing around. This is my announcement, folks. Christ is returning. Trust him. Shape up. Get ready. Don't have sex. And keep your vessels, in control. Get ready for the heavenward call. And that suggests, to answer that question again, it's a real physical. It is going to be physical going up to heaven, but you have to be like super pure to do it.
He also doesn't want them to get married unless they're burning with lust. So
that's 1 Corinthians. Yeah. So now we come to 1 Corinthians, and the issue in 1 Corinthians now. This is probably my favorite letter of all. It's super long, and now Paul's got himself in really deep doo-doo, right? Because this is the first time we see other teachers have come through, and those teachers include Peter. Right, Jesus' closest student, Cephas, Peter, Cephas, right, the Rocky. His name was actually Simon, but Jesus gave him the name, Rocky. And this guy Rocky has come through. Either he or his associates have come through town somehow, and wow, they're teaching something different. And another guy named Apollos has come through. Now, Paul has a friend in Corinth, so he goes to Corinth, he establishes the group there, and then he goes away to Ephesus, back into Asia Minor. So he's gone down into the south of Greece, Athens, Corinth, and then he goes back to Ephesus. And when he's back in Ephesus on the Turkish side, right, today, his friend Chloe sends some snitches to him, some slaves, and he says in 1 Corinthians opening, Chloe's people, notice they don't have names, right? That's why I say they're slaves. Chloe's people, it's like she owns these people, have told him there's factionalism. I've heard from Chloe's people that some of you say I belong to Paul, but only some of you. Others say, hey, no, I'm going with Cephas. And others say, I belong to Apollos. I'm a big fan of Apollos. And Paul says, no. And that's where I mentioned, he says, I didn't baptize any of you because I didn't want you to say, I belong to Paul. But in the first 3 chapters, he's sounding very kind of friendly, except that he warns Apollos. He says, I laid the foundation. This is back in chapter 3. I laid the foundation because I am the master builder, right? And I'm the foundation layer. Another person is building on my foundation, and he better watch out how he builds on it, because when the fire comes, everything's going to be tested, and only those things that are enduring will survive. Whereas stuff that's made out of hay and straw and wood, it's going to be burned up, right? So anybody who builds on my foundation better watch out. And then he says, I'm talking about me and Apollos here, in case you didn't get it. And by the way, Apollos, I don't suppose you know, did you study any Greek, Derek?
I have not. No,
okay.
I want to though. Now I've got a piqued interest. Now I really want to.
Okay, but here I just want to pass along a pun in Greek. So there's a guy named Apollos, right? And in Greek, the word for destroy is apolumi. And when you want to say in the future, I will destroy, you say Apollo, right? And then so what he does is, when he's talking about the wisdom of the world, which Paul rejects, he says, he quotes a verse from the Bible that says, Apollo ten sophion ton sophon, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise. I would suggest this is a pun on the name of Apollos, because he says in 4:6, just before the part I'm quoting here, I've been talking about me and Apollos. That's what all this is about. And Apollos is the guy who came along and is building on his foundation. And Paul, in response, attacks the wisdom of, the great debater, the great rhetorician, the great orator. And it seems clear to me. That's what I mean by half of a conversation. Like, he doesn't come right out and say that. You have to read the thing as half of a conversation.
Right.
But by the way, at the end of this letter, they will ask him all these questions from 7:1 onward, right? About the things you wrote about. Well, first marriage, and then meat offered to idols, and then spiritual gifts, then the resurrection. Then in chapter 16, 2 issues. Now concerning the collection, 16:1, this is what I want you to do. I want you to put aside money every week, and then it'll be ready when I come and pick it up. And then in 16:12, now concerning Apollos, he can't come right now. Right? This is amazing. So one of the questions that they sent to him was, when can Apollos come back? Because they're writing to him, and he's in Ephesus, and presumably Apollos is also in Ephesus somewhere. And Paul says, about Apollos. He can't come right now, but he has said himself, I'm going to come to you. You don't have many, you have a lot of tutors in Christ. You don't have many fathers. How many fathers does a person have? One. In
Right.
Christ Jesus, I became your father. I am, Luke, I am your father. I am your father. I brought you into being through the announcement, right? This is I in Christ Jesus through the announcement brought you into being. Have some respect, right? I am your father. Don't be following these other guys as if they were your fathers. Now, that chapter you were referring to, chapter 9 of this letter, we've not made use of this authority to take money, to endure, because we endure anything rather than obscuring the announcement of Christ. So the reason, what I'm doing here is not trying to go through the whole letter, is just to show you again how the announcement keeps coming up. What is my reward then if I don't get paid from you? My reward is that in announcing it, I make the announcement cost-free with a view to not exploiting the authority I have in the announcement. Namely, I'm the one chosen for the announcement. I am all things to all people. When I meet Jews, I become like a Jew. When I meet Gentiles, I become like a Gentile. I do it all on account of the announcement. Now I would remind you, he comes to chapter 15, of the announcement I announced to you, which you received from me and through which you are being rescued, if you hold fast to the teaching I announced to you. Namely, Christ died, was buried, rose, and will soon return. So that's chapter 15.
I have to make a quick comment. There's a scholar that I actually interviewed on this channel one time, and you might think this is interesting, but it wasn't just a circumcision issue. He said he thinks, and I don't know how this squares up with 1 Corinthians 15, but he thinks that the other apostles did not teach a Christ crucified, because in Paul's letter in Galatians, he says pretty much that they're saying you need to circumcise, and he's saying, what, we're going to crucify the Lord again? Like you're making the crucifixion of Jesus null and void by your practicing of this law. And so he says, and I don't know if you've actually looked into this or not, or considered this, that the apostles that he's arguing with are the people that are trying to convert the Galatians. Oh, foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? They're not teaching a Christ crucified, resurrected doctrine or something like that. I don't know.
So that's Galatians, right? So
right.
We're just talking here about 1 Corinthians. So I would make a distinction. I think the threat that Paul faces in 1 Corinthians is what you have called before, I think, Derek, realized eschatology.
Right.
That is in. So I'm sorry, I didn't take the time for this. It's only because, this when I began teaching this stuff, it was a year-long course. It was like 26 weeks working through these texts. So, we have one session to do this today, or
I know.
So I'm just skimming through. What I mainly want to focus on is how Paul's announcement is not shared by everybody. It's so other people have different teachings which are not the announcement. Right. So in 1 Corinthians, I would suggest that the threat that he faces there is from a guy, Apollos, who he presents as a wise philosopher type. In chapter 4 of 1 Corinthians, he says in 8 to 12 or so, he says, already you have become rich. Already you are, satisfied. Already you have become kings. I wish I could have those things. No, I'm waiting for Christ's return. It's a very sarcastic piece, but it, I think, quite revealing of what's going on. So Apollos has come to town and said to them, hey, Paul told you got to wait and suffer and be beaten up and abused. No. It's about living now in the present, and Christ gives you the wisdom to live now, right? So I think, and that fits with the 1 Corinthians 15 thing. So the issue there is the nature of resurrection. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:12, how can some of you say there's no resurrection. These are Christ followers, right, who have been now following Apollos' line. He says, how is it some of you are saying there's no resurrection? It's like the whole foundation of everything. But then he has to back away and say, well, what I really mean is I'm talking about spiritual resurrection, and Christ, to come back to that question someone asked in the super chat, Christ became a life-giving spirit, right? He was physical, but what is sown into the ground is not like what comes out. Like you sow seeds into the ground, but look, you see this great, wheat come out. It's not what you see come out of the ground is not like what goes into it. And Christ was a physical being when he died, but he was raised. He became a life-giving spirit. And then he even goes on to say, flesh and blood cannot go into heaven, right? You can't do that if you're flesh and blood. You have to become a spirit. And that's why everybody's going to be transformed in the twinkling of an eye, he says, the blink of an eye. We who are alive will all be transformed so we can go to heaven. And this flesh, this mortal flesh, has to be transformed to immortal spirit, to go to heaven. So, yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating. I'm sorry we can't spend more time on it, on that issue today. But my simple point is that whole approach to things has forced Paul to recalibrate and restate. And that's why First Thessalonians is so nice, because that happens before any of this, before he does any recalibrating, before he's been challenged by other Christian teachers. He's just got a very simple idea. Christ died, rose, is returning from heaven. We're going up to meet him. That's the announcement, right? Now he's still teaching the announcement, but he keeps modifying it because, like a sensible person, when it's under fire, he has to say, that's not really what I meant. Let me formulate it a different way, right? But now he changes it like a politician, right? I didn't say that. Yes, you did. Like it's on the record. You said that. Well, no, you're taking it out of context. So I meant something else. I meant, that's what we see everybody in public life doing all the time.
I heard this was also like a common trait of like rabbis. Rabbis sometimes even say contradictory things.
Sure.
The same rabbi. So I've heard this from other scholars like Audiophir and Ishai Rosensky, who came on and they're like, Paul sounds kind of rabbinic in a way, but he's a swindler. He knows what he's doing, and he's moving his, to fit the ideas they want to hear.
Yeah. Well, and that will exactly they want to hear, but will preserve his announcement, right? So it's somehow the announcement, but it has to take. He says it in 1 Corinthians 9:21-23. He says it clearly. To the Jews, I became a Jew. I became as one under the law, though I'm not under law, right? I don't follow Jewish law, but I acted as if I did. I became as if I were that, so that I could win them for the announcement. And then I did the same thing with Gentiles and with other people, right? I'm adaptable. It's the first one of not the first, the second or third article I tried to I published. I first called it Paul the Chameleon. For exactly this reason. But look at now Philippians. In Philippians, he's in prison, and most people think this is in Ephesus. So he goes back to Ephesus after Corinth, and he gets actually thrown in the Huskow because he is a disturbance in town. So he's been tossed into some kind of holding cell, and is in the ancient world. There's no prison system. There's only holding tanks where your friends have to take care of you. They bring you food. They have to watch out for you because there's no state, kind of jail system. So he says, I thank my God because of your sharing in the announcement from the first day until now. It's right for me to think this way. All of you are participants with me in the defense and confirmation of the announcement. I want you to know that what has befallen me, my being in chains here, is for the progress of the announcement. Now, this is getting really interesting. Some proclaim Christ. So he's talking about other Christian teachers. from grudging, rivalry, strife, supposing they can increase my suffering by chains. This may mean that actually other Christian teachers helped him to be arrested. It's not clear. I'm not sure that's the case, but remember, we're reading only one half of a conversation here. Others proclaim Christ from love, knowing that I'm sitting here for the defense of the announcement. So here already we see clearly there are Christ followers, teachers that Paul adamantly disagrees with. We don't have a clear picture of who they are, except that he's going to really attack them in a minute. So only conduct your life, worthily of the announcement of Christ, so that you are standing firm in one spirit, striving together in one mind for the trust in the announcement. You certainly know, Philippians, that in the beginning of the announcement, when I left Macedonia, no one else shared with me in giving and receiving except you alone. But in that letter, in chapter 3, verse 2 and following, because I'm focused here on the announcement, I didn't want to detour, but that's where he says, watch out for the dogs, watch out for those who mutilate the flesh, because they want to glory in your flesh. But then he says, we are the true circumcision who worship God in our spirit. So what's the threat there? Obviously, there are some Christian teachers, and Philippians is the first place we see this happening. Some Christian Christ-following teachers who are saying, hey, wait a minute, it's not so easy to follow Christ like that, like Paul's telling you. You need to become a Jew. Christ was a Jew. Jesus was a Jew. If you're going to follow him as a teacher, as Messiah, you need to become a Jew, be circumcised if you're male, follow the laws. And Paul is absolutely ridiculing this idea. And he says in Philippians 3, hey, I'm a Hebrew of the Hebrews. Now, if anybody knows, I was a Pharisee. I know the law, but I count all of that as excrement, as that's the word he uses, taskubala in Greek, dung, basically shit. I count it as, that now because I follow Christ, and I'm waiting they're trying to get you involved in a political community on earth. Our political community in Philippians 3:20-21 is in heaven. And from there, we are waiting for a savior who will evacuate us, right? So he keeps coming back to the announcement, but now you can see how other Christ teachers are saying, wait. It's not so simple. Paul's got it all wrong. He's flattering you, and he's not telling you the whole truth. You need to become Jewish.
And I just love this to say, if you're a Christian and you're watching, and I know some of you in the comments, by the way, the super chats, I'm going to get at the end. I promise you all of your questions will have enough time for Dr. Mason to answer. But if you're a Christian and you're listening to this, you really have to just say, you have to either accept, well, since Paul's version won out, it's really the truth. That's your best guess. But really, ultimately, what if Paul wasn't really before these other Christians, and these other Christians were closer to whatever the original message was, if there was one original? It just makes you think, how do you trust this guy? He's already having accusations. You have to believe what the Orthodox Church put together and said, we're keeping this guy. We want this message. How do you know what you have is the truth, and not because you experience or feel it? There's people in every culture, every religion that have experiences. So I just have to make that comment, and I am getting your super chats. So thank you all for the super chats. They're all going to get asked.
May I make two quick comments? One is I personally say, in terms of being a Christian or not a Christian, I just want to say there are lots of friends I have who are committed Christians, not super evangelicals, but I have nothing against them either. But the friends I have who are Christians can often treat this stuff as one of them had a very nice image of this is like a family photo album. This is like many generations ago, people did weird stuff, right? And they were all squabbling with each other. So Christ following today isn't necessarily like any of this stuff. So what I'm trying to say is, if you are a Christian, there are lots of ways of being a Christian that you can assimilate this stuff, too. I have no dog in that race, so to speak. But I just want to say, what I'm saying is not anti-Christian. I think I'm just trying to do a historical approach here to understand.
I think what you're doing, though, in effect, by just the conclusions we're drawing, is kind of casting doubt on this absolute strict fundamentalism that I see going on, that I was part of. So
yeah, me too.
If you want to remain a believer, that's fine. I've got really good friends. Ian Mills, he comes on here. He's a Christian. He's a scholarly minded thinker. So he accepts that there's problems. He accepts that this is not a magic book that was written in a gold tablet, sent directly down by the finger of God. Like, he has a very human side of what's going on here. So
yeah. I just wanted to get that in too. I'm not. My intention is not to attack Christianity, but to understand how it all began. And indeed, it does mean, if you're going to think historically, you do have to bring a skeptical mind to it. That's what history is. That's what historians do, is look at things skeptically and try to reconstruct what's happening. So in Galatians now, you have this coming back to the announcement right at the beginning, 1:11. I want you to know, brothers, the announcement that was announced by me, it's not human. And so here again, we got one half of the conversation going on. What is the charge against Paul that leads him to open with this? I didn't receive it from a human being. I wasn't taught it by anybody. It came by revelation of Jesus Christ. So what would be the accusation, do you think, Derek?
That these other guys taught him, or he got the message from someone else, and so he's trying to say, no, I got it from God, the good guy upstairs.
Exactly, because the charge is that he got it from the apostles before him, and then he twisted it, he perverted it in order to make it easier for people to follow Paul. So whereas if they were following like the original students, they'd have to become Jews. They'd have to become circumcised if they're male, have to take on the law. Paul took Christ's idea in some way, but completely simplified it, transformed it for his own purpose so that he could attract a large following. That's the charge, I think, against him. And he's saying, no, I didn't. What I'm teaching you the truth, but I didn't get it from them and twist it. I got this straight from the resurrected Christ. And now he justifies that. I went up to Jerusalem to see Jesus' disciples. This is quite interesting, right? But hey, I didn't go because they told me to go. I don't recognize their authority. I went in response to a revelation that Christ told me to go. I laid out for them the announcement that I proclaim among the nations. Notice, this is Paul's thing, the announcement. It's not their thing, right? They don't have the announcement. Paul does. We did not yield in submission to them. That is, the false brothers, he said, who would enslave it. He said there were some false brothers there who wanted to enslave us. We didn't yield to them for a moment so that the truth of the announcement could continue for you, Gentiles.
This sounds like the enslaved could potentially be catching on to the whole chain thing. And here we go with the law. I mean, you're right. The other one could be that he was imprisoned. But the other explanation, I suspect, that people interpret that to mean is they're bringing a burden. They're bringing slavery. They're bringing, I'm a slave of Christ, not a slave of Torah or a slave of some other burden.
Yeah.
Which, you know what I mean? So.
No, I think you're right. That's clear in this letter. I just want to make a distinction. I think 1 Corinthians is about a different kind of threat to Paul from this more or less realized eschatology that, no, it's not about a future resurrection into heaven. No, Christ is the teacher of wisdom. In 1 Corinthians. In Galatians, very clearly, it's all about circumcision, the law. And then he says, these esteemed men added nothing to me. He actually says in this passage, what they are doesn't matter to me. They're the so-called pillars of Christ following. I don't care who they claim to be. Christ looks on the inside, not status. It's not a status issue. They mean nothing to me. I only went up because of a revelation. Anyway, they didn't add anything to me. They didn't say, Paul, you need to start teaching the law. No, on the contrary, seeing that I had been entrusted with the announcement for the foreskin, as he puts it in Greek, it's usually translated more politely in church translations. There's the circumcision, heperitome, and there's the acrobustia. There's the foreskin. These are the two groups Paul talks about: the circumcision and the foreskin. Those not circumcised. So it's usually translated the uncircumcised. Just as Peter had his teaching for the circumcised, Paul's claiming that they shook my hands and said, okay, we're not going to disturb you. And I went away. The only thing is, in verse 10, which I didn't include here, they said, the only thing is you have to remember the poor. And that seems to be the foundation of the collection that Paul was making for Jerusalem. Because in Romans 15, he says, I've got a collection from all of Macedonia and Achaia for the poor among the saints in Jerusalem. Right? That's who the collection is for. So it seems that at this meeting, again, we're looking at half of a conversation here, but we have to put together all the pieces. It seems that this is where they said, you know what, Paul, we're going to let you do whatever you want to do with the Gentiles. That's not our concern. But hey, if you're going to go around talking about Christ and you're going to be, he was our teacher, and we have Christ followers here in Jerusalem who are very poor and suffering. You're going to be in all these rich countries. Here's the deal. We're going to let you, we're not going to interfere with you. Tell them whatever you want. But why don't you send some money back here from these rich folks as a sign of good faith? And Paul is therefore very, very concerned that he gets a large collection from Macedonia and Achaia. And that's what he mentions in Romans. When he writes Romans, he says, I've got this big collection from Macedonia and Achaia. I'm hoping it will be accepted by the people in Jerusalem. So it's really quite amazing, right?
Someone said it sounds like a pyramid scheme. Thank you.
Yeah. It's quite amazing. There's a guy, a filmmaker named Robert Orlando, who made a whole film about this called The Polite Bribe, and wrote a book about it. Scholars know about it. New Testament scholars know about it. It's no surprise. It's right there in the text, but it's often kind of played down because it's such a strange thing. Right. But it's really important. It comes up in 1 Corinthians. This is how I want you to take the collection, 1 Corinthians 16. Put aside money every week. 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9 are all about getting the collection back on track again. Then there's this reference in Galatians, probable. Then in Romans, he's saying, I've got the collection finally. So it is a big deal, actually, that he's spending a lot of time on. And then he says in chapter 2, when I saw that they were not, so we got this clear arrangement, but then I said I had to tell Peter off. When up at Antioch, Peter was up there, and he said, I saw they were not walking straight in accord with the truth of the announcement. I said to Peter, how can you, this is singular here in Greek, how can you compel the nations to live like Judeans when you have been willing to eat with Gentiles, and it didn't bother you until some men from James came along. This is Jesus' brother James. Some of these chaps came along and you got scared because you were eating with Gentiles and you withdrew and you stopped. And I said, hey, this is not truthful. How can you're compelling Gentiles to live like Jews, but you screwed up here, right? You got to admit it. You were eating with Gentiles, so you actually saw no problem. So what I'm trying to say simply in this brief talk we have today, it's not all that brief in the end, but what my simple point is, as I ram through these letters, Paul, clearly, these are one half of a conversation. And we're seeing Paul in conflict, in serious conflict, right, with others. We're not getting into all the aspects of that conflict. I'm only focusing on how he takes ownership of the announcement. So even when he writes to Romans, which is a group that he did not establish, he hasn't been to Rome, but there's a Christ following community, he introduces himself as Paul, the slave of Christ, called to be the apostle, specially designated for God's announcement, right? And then later in the letter, he calls it my announcement. He says, I serve God in my spirit by announcing the announcement of his son. I long to see you that I might give you some spiritual gift. Hence my eagerness to bring the announcement even to you who are in Rome. Why? I'm not ashamed of the announcement. Who said he should be ashamed of it? This group in Rome, I would argue, is a Jewish Christian group. So Paul's got the announcement for the Gentiles. Someone else established this group in Rome. According to tradition, it was Peter who established it. I don't know if that's true or not, but it does seem to be a Jewish Christian group because the letter he writes to them is filled with scripture citations everywhere, and he addresses them as Jews and as the descendants of Abraham and as people who know the law in chapter 7 of Romans. So I think that, but he says right here, these are Christ followers, and he says, I would like to come and bring the announcement to you. So that's why it's not the gospel, right? It's not the good news shared by all Christ followers. It's Paul's thing, right? And then he even says, I'm talking about the day when Christ returns and judges the secrets of humans according to my announcement. I've written rather boldly to you, realizing you're not my community, because of the grace given to me by God to be an agent of Christ for the nations. That's my sphere, the Gentiles, in the priestly service of God's announcement. So he's standing as a Jew now. And then he says, that's what I referred to at the beginning, from Jerusalem as far around as Illyricum, that is the whole Eastern Mediterranean northeast, I have fully proclaimed the announcement of Christ. There's no more room. And then in chapter 16, now to God who's able to strengthen you according to my announcement, right? It's not something he shares with them. And when he refers to what they believe, he just calls it the teaching that you have. He doesn't call it the announcement, right? And then in the pseudo-Pauline letters, like Ephesians, they also realize that the announcement is Paul's thing, right? So they, like 2 Thessalonians, the angels in flaming fire wreaking vengeance on those who do not heed the announcement of our Lord, for which reason he called you through the announcement of ours. And then in 1 Timothy, the announcement with which I was entrusted, right? 2 Timothy, according to my announcement. So these are writers claiming to be Paul, and they realize full well that the announcement is his special thing. So where does the announcement attract enemies? Here's the passage I was referring to in Philippians 3. Look at this. Beware of the dogs. Beware of the evil workers. Beware of those who mutilate the flesh. Mutilate the flesh. That's circumcision he's talking about, right? But he's taking a very hostile view. It's we who are the circumcision, who worship God in spirit, have no confidence in the flesh, even though, hey, I have reason for confidence in the flesh. I was circumcised the 8th day, member of, Israel, tribe of Benjamin, Hebrew of the Hebrews, Pharisee. Whatever gains I had, I regard as loss. For his sake, I've suffered the loss. I regard it as feces, in order that I may gain Christ. Our political community is in heaven, where we're awaiting a Savior. So clearly, he's got a problem here with other Christ teachers. And he says, just after this, he says their end is destruction. Their God is their belly, their flesh, and their end is destruction. Who are these people? Remember, at the beginning of the letter, he said people preach Christ out of rivalry. And, they glory in the flesh. They have confidence in the flesh.
Real quick before you go forward, I was going to say there's a scholar, Matthew Thassan. I don't know if you've heard of him before.
Yeah.
He wrote a book about this whole the Gentiles being these dogs. In Philippians, he mentions this, and I saw a video on YouTube where he's being interviewed at Yale or somewhere, Harvard, something, one of these prestigious colleges, and they're asking him, and they're saying, tell us what you're finding, because we have a Phoenician woman being called a dog in the Gospels, and there's kind of this hint at Jews viewing pagans as dogs, or at least potential evidence there. And so he thinks here in Philippians, these mutilators of the flesh are Gentiles that are circumcising. And then they're telling other Gentiles, you need to be circumcised. I just thought I'd make that comment for people to kind of think like, what the heck? Like, so he's really against nations, or the nations, the ethne, practicing Torah to a point where he's like, but then again, I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's possible. It's possible. And I think part of the problem is that scholars, in my view, it's a problem. Scholars want to preserve the core of the apostles as a kind of unified group, and want to push all this off onto Gentiles and people who have misunderstood. I'm not saying that's the motive of the person you're referring to, but that has been a motive, a strong motive in scholarship, right? Is to preserve a kind of unity among the apostles, including Paul, and then to say it was all these other people who were preaching.
Good point.
But because the reason I raise that is, if you just look at the passage again, why is he saying, I was circumcised? Hey, I'm as good as anybody else. A member of the tribe of Israel, the tribe of Benjamin. I'm a Hebrew of the Hebrews. I counted as loss. I counted as,
He's not necessarily saying, when he says those who mutilate the flesh, he's not necessarily saying that these are Gentiles that are circumcised, that are trying to make everyone else. But those who mutilate the flesh, those are preaching a message of doing this. Is that potentially what you're saying here?
Well, I think it's clear that that's what they are doing. They're wanting to circumcise you, or have you circumcised.
Got it.
But my question is, why then is he defending himself against them by praising his own Jewish credentials?
If he's not dealing with Jews, right.
It could be that he's saying, hey, they're just Gentiles, and I am super Jewish by background and know all this stuff. It could be, but that would be an added level of complication, it seems to me. The simplest explanation is that they are people with credentials, right? As remember in Galatians, when he says, I don't care who they are. I don't care if an angel from heaven should give you another teaching than the one I gave you. He even says, if I came back to you and told you something different from what I told you the first time, don't believe it. It doesn't matter whoever they are, they're going to hell. I curse them. I anathematize them, whoever they are. So I think actually that the problem is that these people have high status as Jews, as followers of Christ. And Paul's saying, his response to them is, look, I'm as good as they are, but because of following Christ, I gave all that up, and they didn't, right? They're still clinging to the past.
Got it.
And I'm not. And part of the reason I say that is in his next letter, probably 2 Corinthians, look at what he says. He makes it very clear. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they? So these are people who are somehow coming across as making a credential out of this. Are they descendants of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? Yes, they are. I'm talking like a madman. I'm better. I'm a better servant of Christ. Far greater labors than they ever had to go through. I've been in prison more than they have, often near death. 5 times I received from Jews the 39 lashes. This is serious corporal punishment, right? 39 lashes. He says 5 times. They didn't receive it. Why not? Because they teach the law. They teach following the law and being a good Jew. And I don't. so I get beaten up by the Jews. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. I've been a fool. You forced me to it. You should have been supporting me against these super apostles, in Greek, hyper apostles. So who are these hyper apostles? Again, there are a number of scholars who say, well, they are just people pretending to be apostles. They're Gentiles. Okay, maybe, but I don't understand Paul's rhetoric in that case. Like, why is he?
Because, like, give us another. If there was more evidence suggesting that there were apostles who were potentially, using that term, super apostles, like superior, I can see an argument being made that James or Peter or someone else was above him, or that argument being played. But to act like Joe Schmo comes out of the woodworks and he's a super apostle, to me, either we're missing evidence and we don't know, or this fits the criteria better. And I think what you're saying, where you're headed with this, is better.
I think, well, one of the principles of historical work is economy, right? The principle, what's the simplest? You don't want to introduce too many moving parts that are unnecessary for the explanation. What's the smallest number of conditions? It seems to me that's the most obvious one. Why is Paul freaking out here? He's clearly losing it. Why is he so upset? He's granting that they're apostles. He's granting their status, but he's saying, hey, I'm even better, and you should have stuck up for me against this threat. And putting this together with Galatians, whoever they are, I don't care who they are. I don't, even an angel from heaven. It seems to me that they are people with obvious status, right? I'm agreeing with you, Derek. I think that when Paul's, here's what's happened. I think Paul goes around saying, hey, Christ is returning, follow him. Then these guys come around, namely, he says, remember in 1 Corinthians 9, you cited the passage, Derek.
Right.
When Peter or the brothers of the Lord travel around, they take their wives with them and they get paid. So, why don't I? So that already tells us that actually Jesus' students and his family were traveling around. So maybe they're not coming right into Paul's communities, but they're coming close. They're coming into the cities. And people are looking at them and saying, hey, wait a minute. This looks like the real deal here. These are actually Jesus' students and his family members. If anybody knows what he was about, it's these people. So Paul's getting really, really annoyed because they are stepping on his turf. And he's saying, hey, okay, yeah, they're the Hebrews. Are they? Yeah, but so am I. Israelites, so am I. I'm a better servant of Christ than they are. So they must really have something going for them, right? To, first of all, attract Paul's followers to them, and then attract his. So the same with Galatians here. I'm astonished you're so quickly deserting the one who called you, whether he's referring to himself or Christ, turning to a different announcement. Not that there is a different one. There is no other announcement. But some who are confusing you want to pervert the announcement. But even if we or an angel from heaven should proclaim to you an announcement contrary to the one, let him be cursed. I repeat, anybody, I don't care who it is, let him be accursed. And then there's this thing about him telling off Peter. So it looks like Peter is one who compels Judeans or non-Judeans to live as Judeans.
James sends people to spy out his freedom. And what are you doing, James? Why are you spying on Paul?
Yeah,
this is big red flags to me. Even Elaine Pagels recently was interviewed on this channel, and I really love her to death. I can't wait to see her in person, and one day meet you in person. I know it's international, but I would really like to come and spend. If I'm going international, I might as well get everything I can out of you.
Okay, come on over here. You're welcome. Yeah.
Seriously, I will do like clips, and we will record high definition and do it right. But Elaine Pagels is 100% in line with what you're saying here. So for anyone wondering.
But I have to tell you, it's not the prevailing view in early Christianity. And I think it has a lot to do with guilt over the Second World War and the way Christianity has gone in relation to Judaism. I think there are very strong theological ecumenical kind of moves to say, Paul was within Judaism, he was a good Jew, and all of that. I just don't think it makes sense of his letters. And it is appalling, of course, what Christianity has done with Jews, but I don't think we can remedy that by saying Paul was actually a good Jew. That's not what he wants to say, anyhow. So at the end of Galatians, what's really amazing here is that Paul says, it is those who want to make a good showing in the flesh who try to force you to be circumcised, and only so that they may not be persecuted for the cross of Christ. Even the circumcised don't obey the law, but they want you to be circumcised so that they can boast about your flesh. Now, we recognize this is rhetoric. It's highly unlikely that they're going around boasting about, foreskins collected. This is rhetoric. But look at matching up. If we match up, again, half of a conversation here, but if we match up the clues, who has he already accused of?
Peter.
Yeah. This is exactly what he's accused Peter of.
Holy moly, man.
Right? Not obeying the law, but wanting others to be circumcised so that he doesn't get heat. So that Paul is taking all the heat for this new announcement, right? And Paul is saying, hey, this is the truth, but they can't handle the truth, right? They are not going to stick up for it. So they're going to be weak and say, yeah, you should follow the law, observe the law, be good Jews. You should come and be circumcised and follow the law. Yes, and he says the only reason they're doing that is so that they won't get the heat that I'm getting, right, for preaching the cross without all of that, right? So and at the root of it all is James, right? In the previous passage, it was men from certain people came from James. Peter used to eat with the non-Judeans, but after they arrived, he drew back and kept himself separate for fear of the circumcision faction, right? And right. So that's that's the men from James who are the circumcision faction. So we get a pretty clear alignment here, coming together. The Judean Christians based in Jerusalem are feeling heat because of their message. So they send emissaries to teach Paul's converts, or they're in the same town. And now we get these tensions, even in Acts. And this is a curious thing. Acts will try to smooth all of this over, as we've already discussed. But even in Acts, when Paul arrives in Jerusalem, the brothers welcomed us warmly. This is one of those we passages you were talking about. The next day, Paul went with us to visit James, and all the elders were present. After greeting them, Paul related one by one all the great things God had done among the nations. When they heard it, they praised God. And then they said, now, brother, you see how many thousands of believers there are among the Jews. They're all zealous for the law. They've been told about you that you teach the Jews living among the nations, the Gentiles, to forsake Moses, and that you tell them not to circumcise their children or observe their customs. They're going to hear that you've come, and there's going to be hell to pay, right? They are angry with you. So here's what we're going to do. You pay the money for you go through this ritual of purification and pay for their shaving of their heads at the end of the Nazirite vow. In this way, everyone will know there's nothing true in what they've been told about you. Now, this is not Paul's idea, right? This is James's idea, according to Acts, to try to smooth over what people think of Paul, which is that he's against the law. He's against the Jewish people, the temple. He says that's what they've been told about you, that you teach against this place and against circumcision and against the law. They're gonna want your head on a platter. So here's a diplomatic move. You go and do something really Jewish, and then everyone will see, oh, okay, I guess But wow, I mean, that's in Acts, right? Which is, Acts is really trying to smooth all this over. And yet, even there, you have this story. So the other kind of opposition to Paul is what we saw before. Some say, I belong to Apollos. And then Paul says, look, I laid the foundation. Someone else is building on it. Each builder better be careful how he does it. No one can lay any foundation other than that which has been laid. The wisdom of this world is foolishness with God. So let no one boast, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas. I've applied, this is the passage I was referring to before. I've applied all this to Apollos and myself. Already you have everything you want. You become rich. You become kings. I wish you had become kings. We might become kings with you. We were fools for the sake of Christ. You're wise. You claim to be wise. We are weak. You claim to be strong. You're held in honor. We are in disrepute. We're hungry. We're thirsty. You guys are doing fine. I'm not writing this to make you ashamed, but to plead with you as my children. Because you might have 10,000 tutors in Christ. You only have one Father. I gave you birth. Be imitators of me. That's why I sent Timothy, my beloved and faithful child, to remind you of my ways in Christ as I teach them everywhere. Some of you, thinking I'm not coming, have become arrogant. Well, I will come if the Lord wills. What do you want? Should I come with a stick or as a gentle person? So this is amazing, right? I mean, Paul is showing here in this one half of a conversation, Chloe's snitches have told him that, hey, you know, a lot of people are following Apollos here, and they got a whole different view now. And Paul's saying, okay, I'm sending Timothy. He's going to remind you of my ways because I'm your father, not this guy. Mm-hmm. And some of you are getting arrogant because you think I won't come back. I will come back. And hey, I got to bring a stick with me. This is quite amazing, right? So what we see in the first generation, now I am coming to a close here. Paul is a Jew by birth, but he radically abandons this because of, as he says himself, I gave it all up. I counted as, you know, rubbish to follow Christ and wait for him. His announcement is simply Christ died, rose, will soon return and pour out his wrath on the rest of the world. While waiting for him, those who trust, believe, must maintain a state of purity. He faces at least three kinds of opposition. One, from the good citizens of the polis, the cities he goes through, Philippi, Thessalonica, Corinth, Ephesus. They throw him in prison. They beat him up. Just like cynics, often itinerant philosophers, charged with flattering the gullible with nonsense and then getting money to leave town. And this will be a repeated criticism that we will see in the letter of Pliny to Trajan, in Celsus and Porphyry and Julian, especially these philosophers. But already in Pliny's letter, you see that, you know, people have, you see what happens in Pliny's province. You'll see Christians have spread, and there's no more sacrifices being bought and so on. So you can see the good people, put in quotation marks, you know, the good people of town want this change. They're very worried about these Christians who are undermining their traditional values, their traditional ways. So that's one kind of opposition to Paul. Second kind, Jesus' brother, James, and his students understand Jesus only in a Judean context. And they say, look, Paul's cheapened this whole thing for you. He's given you a, you know, Christ following light. Just wait for Christ to return from heaven. No, that's not what it's about. If you want to understand Christ as Messiah, you can only do that if you become a Jew, become circumcised if you're male. So this stream in early Christianity will remain a potent force until at least the 4th century. A group called, that Eusebius and Irenaeus called the Ebionites. This is from a Hebrew word, the Evionim, the poor. And they seem to take their name from the poor, the very Jerusalem Christians, right? And wear it as a badge of honor. And then finally, Apollos and company understand Jesus as a teacher of spiritual wisdom. That's what we see in 1 Corinthians. They're not waiting for a future resurrection. You've already been raised. You've already become rich. You already have wisdom. That's what Christ came to bring.
Kind of sounds proto-Gnostic, actually.
It's the foundation. You took the words right out of my mouth.
Wow.
It's the next line. This is the foundation of the Gnostic understanding of Christ. And I would suggest, this is for another, maybe next time, this is actually grounded in Jesus' parables, which are about wisdom and not about waiting for future salvation. So to summarize visually, then what I've been trying to do here is use Paul's letters as a window into the first generation. And what my basic argument is that they are half of a conversation. And that's the great thing about them. It would be much easier to say they came from another time, they were all just invented, they were fabricated, if they were essays, if they were, Paul's vision of, Christ as, and the archons of this world or whatever. If it was just Paul working out this fabulous idea, it could come from any time, I grant that. But my whole point has been they really look like half of a conversation in real time. That leads us to all this conflict. And so the question for the historian is, at the bottom of all this, how do you best explain that you have someone who's known to be Jesus' brother and his students in vigorous contestation with Paul? We don't have their writings, unfortunately. We only have his. But because they're half of a conversation in each case, we can piece together something of the diversity of that first generation. Okay.
Oh my gosh. Seriously. This is one of the better episodes of MythVision that I have ever done. I know this without a doubt. This is, if you stuck through this is one of the best things I've ever went through and delved into when it comes to early Christianity. So I have to commend you and say thank you, Dr. Mason.
It's my pleasure.
You are something else, man. You really are. And whether people who are watching can agree with everything you say or they might have a different take, no matter what, you're wonderful. And I want you to know that. We have a lot of super chats I'm going to get into here from people throughout. So I appreciate all the support. This was just absolutely fantastic. So
thank you. Shall I close out this window here?
You can. Yeah, you can. Yeah. You don't have to use it anymore. And so let me go ahead and share the screen. Let's jump right into your questions. If you guys are tithing to the Church of MythVision, I can't leave you hanging. So I try not to wait to get your questions answered. But when we're cutting you off and you're getting into the juicy, we'll have time to discuss it. So I'll get yours, Ben. I just saw I got a screenshot you. Hold on one second. So if you don't mind, Jim Wiseman, I'm not doing it in chronological order. I'm just going with the flow here. He says, Dr. Steve, do you consider Paul's Christian detractors as generic messianic teachers or specifically Jesus followers? I think that was answered in the case of what you were describing, but it could be both.
It could be both, but I think the ones Paul's particularly concerned about, remember that he frequently calls them servants of Christ, or like in Philippians, they preach Christ out of envy, rivalry. So now one could argue they preach a Messiah, but I don't think that makes very good sense of Paul's language. And in 2 Corinthians, when he calls them hyper apostles or super apostles, or things like that, I think he's talking mainly. What he's worried about is other teachers of Christ. I think.
Thank you for that. All right. Let's do our next one here. Share screen. Next super chat we're going to cover. Let's go with this golden one here. And let me pull it up on the screen better than that. So Pants Pot, I hope I'm saying that correct. Since it's clear that there were several other Christian missionaries besides Paul, is there an estimate of what portion of very early Christians were actually converted by Paul?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Short answer, no. But we can try to reason it through this way. So Paul's sphere of Paul saw himself, right, as uniquely reaching Gentiles, and we can see that throughout Asia Minor, so what is Western Turkey today, and Greece, there were early communities that sprung up there. So Pliny's letter to Trajan is talking about a community that's grown up there. There's nothing to suggest these are Jewish people. They look like Gentiles because they've stopped buying their normal sacrifices for their temples, the temple to Diana and so on. So it looks like Paul's had a pretty big influence there, just from that perspective. And then simply the fact that his letters were then copied and quoted so often, First Clement, Ignatius to the Philippians and so on, and that he had such a big role, and that Acts, even though Acts makes it very clear, Acts makes it clear that he's not one of the apostles, right? That's quite amazing. Acts says the conditions of being an apostle are you have to have been with Christ. That's kind of putting Paul in his place, but even Acts gives him a very special role, right, from Acts 9 onward as a great missionary, but not an apostle. He's only an apostle in secondary sense that Barnabas is also, but he's not one of the 12. He doesn't fit the criteria laid out in Acts chapter 1. So, but the fact that even Acts gives him such a large role with Barnabas, in reaching the Eastern Mediterranean, I think suggests that his impact was relatively big. But none of this is very big in the first century, right? It's still quite limited. These are people meeting in houses. So he will say, like in the greetings in Romans, greetings to the group that meets in, this person's house or that person's house. So these are small groups.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate that super chat too. Everybody who is super chatting. I really do. And all the birthday wishes. Thank you so much. We're going to just go. I'm going through these questions, so bear with me. What's the meaning of Caesar's household in Philippians?
Aha, fantastic question. There is a recent book. I wish I could remember the author's name. It's just not quite on the tip of my tongue. But there's a very recent book that's devoted to the question of who's Caesar's household. And it's all from this passage in Philippians. So thank you, John, for a great question. It used to be thought that these were so Paul says he's in a place called the Praetorium. And then he's talking about Caesar's household, and he's talking about the whole guard around him. Because of these indications in Philippians, it used to be thought that Paul was imprisoned in Rome, right? That Caesar would have his household only in Rome. Okay, to answer your question, though, well, two things. First of all, most people don't think that anymore because we realize that Caesar's household is a very broad term, right? The oikos in Greek of Caesar is there's no civil service in the Roman Empire. There's no established civil service, nothing like what we have in government, civil servants. It just doesn't exist. But there are freedmen, people who were slaves, working in Caesar's household, most of them very low level, like keeping accounts in different cities, sometimes become freedmen. So they're freed from slavery. So we know of a couple of these people, like in the region of Judea, who were keeping accounts for the territories belonging to the emperor. The revenues from those territories needed to be accounted for. So the emperor would use very low-level people for this. So anybody who was a slave or a freedman in Caesar's, ownership or patronage later, that would be Caesar's household. So anyway, because of that recognition, the person who wrote this book, by the way, is arguing against the idea, which you find in some circles in scholarship, that because of this, it was an early Christian claim as well, that they built on this passage in Philippians to say that Christianity made inroads into like the Roman government from an early stage, the high Roman government. And this person is arguing in the book, no, that's way over-reading, over-interpreting what this means. It's actually very low-level stuff. And for the same reason, we can see that Paul is much more likely in Ephesus in prison, even though he doesn't say where he's in prison, because he hasn't been to Rome yet when this is written, probably.
Or he would have been to the Roman church and not be writing a letter to Rome saying he hadn't
right,
been there, but yeah.
Right, exactly. And also, the big problem is that a lot of information has to go back and forth between Paul in prison and Philippi. So he has to be somewhere pretty near Philippi, and Rome is not near Philippi. So Ephesus is, it's pretty close. So
interesting. Thank you so much. Appreciate that super chat, John. Let's get the next one here. Hold on 1 second. I got a couple by Ben. Ben's the guy who likes to sneak up on us, and he likes to do sneaky things. All right. How much diversity of thought was there about the afterlife in early Christianity, going to heaven versus kingdom of heaven on earth?
Yeah, great question, Ben. Thank you.
So some people are Jehovah's Witnesses, paradise earth, and some people I'm just kidding. I guess I'm kidding. I don't know. That's a good question.
Wow, it's a good question. What I want to suggest to you is this was already argued by several scholars 2 generations ago. There's a book by C.H. Buck and Grew Taylor called Development, something like Development in Paul's Thought. It looks like Paul's already himself changing. So, for example, if you look at 2 Corinthians 4 and 5, he's already seems to be shifting away from the idea of resurrection, waiting. So there's basically 2 ideas of the afterlife, right? You can talk about in the Greek world and the early biblical world is, well, you die. And when your body ends, something lives on or not. I mean, if you're Epicurean, nothing lives on. You just dissolve. But most people, most Greeks, thought that there was some kind of, animating principle, whether it's personal or not, it lives on in some way, like either the shade. So in the Bible, the idea of the kind of, it's not spelled out, but biblical texts talk about that's the Hebrew Bible. I mean, not the New Testament. Talk about people dying and going to be with their fathers, or going to Sheol, this place in the ground, which is kind of like Hades. Everybody goes there, the good, the bad, the ugly, everybody goes there. It's not a place of reward. It's just a place of the dead. And that's very similar to the Greek idea that you have in Homer's epics and so on, that all the dead are there in Hades. That's it. So that's one idea, right, of the afterlife, is simply that you die and then your spirit lives on. That's very different from the idea that developed in Judaism, that when you die, you go into the ground and await the day of resurrection, which will become an idea in Christianity and Islam as well, right? That you're waiting the time of resurrection, but you're a whole person. Mm-hmm. So that's why in Jewish tradition, traditionally, you're not supposed to be cremated. Same in Christianity traditionally, it's changed now for practical reasons, but the idea was, you shouldn't be cremated because your body has to be intact, more or less. It has to be reassembled for resurrection. So these are 2 completely different ideas. And what you see in Paul, to come back to your question, Ben, is that, it was Ben, right? I think.
Yes, Ben.
Is that Paul begins with a clear resurrection idea, right? 1 Thessalonians, 1 Corinthians. But in 2 Corinthians 4, he's beginning to talk about this mortal must put on immortality, and our bodies are fading away and becoming immortal. And then he says that that he gives the impression that when you die, you are with Christ. And even in Philippians, I don't know, which I think comes right before 2 Corinthians in my estimation, if he's in prison then. he's saying, I don't know whether it's better to live on in the flesh or to die and be with Christ. That's a change, right, from what he's been saying in First Thessalonians and First Corinthians about we who are alive and remain and are, go up to heaven. It sounds like now you can die and be with Christ, right? And that the immortal soul is taking over now. You will live on as an immortal soul. So it at least can be argued that Paul's view is changing, even though he's still waiting for the return of Christ now. And this is why, by the way, the church later, the Catholic Church initially, and then other churches later, will develop this idea of limbo, or an intermediate state. Even in evangelical churches now, they generally have this idea that you're waiting for Christ's return, and that's when resurrection will take place. But in the meantime,
purgatory.
Yeah, purgatory, or in Protestant tradition, the spirit is with Christ. So when someone dies, like in Protestant churches, the common thing to say is they will die and be with Christ. Right? They're going to be with Christ. They are in heaven now. Right? The moment that they die, they've gone to heaven. Even though the same people say we're still waiting for Christ to come back and the resurrection, because they're dealing with both sides of Paul's indications. He says both things, right? So in terms of systematic theology, people put it all together and say, well, then it must be the case that the spirit goes to be with Christ immediately, and then when Christ returns, the body catches up, right? And you're reunited.
I love the patchwork of this whole idea that's happening in the New Testament. It's hilarious. But yeah, thank you. Did you answer that though? You're done? I didn't want to cut you off.
No. I hope that's my best effort at it anyway. Yeah.
Thank you. I hope that answered it, Ben. Next one, Adrian, Rocky. Does Paul believe in any kind of physical resurrection? And we talked about this briefly, but the final part that I wanted to ask you, because you went over this, is how does that square with Jesus' physical resurrection? And it sounds like they believe this guy rose from the dead, like physically.
This is really, really, really interesting, man. That's like the most important subject, I think. So
right.
Can I give you my quick take on this?
Absolutely.
It's simply this, that Paul is the earliest source we have for Jesus' resurrection, right? Because he's writing in the first generation. Then will come Mark, then Matthew, then somewhere in there, John and Luke, Acts. But here's what's going on. Paul, for whatever reason, right, if we don't try to psychologize him for a moment, just look at what's in the text and just say this is the earliest account, he makes it, in my view, very, very, very clear that Christ rose as a spirit. That's what he says. He says he says Christ was the second Adam. He reversed Adam's situation. So in Adam's case, God took dust of the earth and breathed into it the spirit and made a living human being, right? The second Adam, Christ, this is what he says in 1 Corinthians 15, began as a physical being and became a life-giving spirit. That's what he says. And then he says, flesh and blood cannot go up to heaven. That's why we all need to be changed. So here's what's really interesting in that first account. Paul knows, if you've ever, some of you will be familiar with Josh McDowell and the whole apologetic tradition. These guys begin their resurrection question by saying, okay, you've got an empty tomb, right? How do you explain the empty tomb? And then they have elaborate arguments about that. Paul mentions nothing about an empty tomb. If you ask Paul how he knows Christ is risen from the dead, he tells you. He gives an elaborate, in 1 Corinthians 15, 1-11, he gives an elaborate account of how you can be sure that Christ rose from the dead. How is that? He appeared to this person. He was seen by that person. He was seen by 500 people at once. and he appeared last of all to me. I'm out of time. But he appeared to the other apostles before me. He appeared to Peter. He appeared to all of them, and last of all, he appeared to me. So for Paul, the appearances are on they're exactly the same. Paul does not say my appearance was in any way like second class. Rather, it's the last of all, he appeared to me. That's Paul's construction. Nothing about an empty tomb, nothing about soldiers guarding the tomb, nothing about that. So Christ died. He became, if you put it all together, his presentation in 1 Corinthians 15, Christ became a spirit, and he appeared to me, just like he appeared to everybody else. So Paul puts it in the same level, right? This is very different from what all of the later texts will do, including Acts, right? So Acts, at the end of this trajectory, what I want to suggest to you is, as time goes on, Christians feel a need to make this more and more physical. Mm-hmm. They feel the need to tie it down because, of course, if you say I believe that Christ rose, and someone says to you, well, how do you believe that? Why do you think that? Well, he spoke to me, well,
well, that gets into, and look, I want you to finish this train of thought, but this is a great question. This super chat brings right into that. Okay. Did Paul suffer from any kind of psychological affliction like psychosis or schizophrenia? Now, you don't have to answer that yet, because that's all like a guess on your end, but it goes into this whole thing, and I'll bring it back up on the screen when you go to address the question. But yeah, this is the point, I think, is like, are you crazy? Like,
well, but listen, if you've been in the evangelical church, you will know a gospel song, right? He lives, Christ Jesus lives today. He walks with me, it talks with me, a long life's lonesome way, I think. He lives, Christ Jesus lives today. You ask me how I know he lives? Oh, he lives, salvation to impart. Pardon me, there's a rhyme in there I missed. Salvation to impart. You ask me how I know he lives? Do you know the song, Derek?
I don't. I've heard he walks and talks with me, but I mean...
But the answer to the question is, you ask me how I know he lives? Some of your viewers will know this. He lives within my heart.
Right.
Okay. So this has been the actual claim of Christians throughout the ages. And I please don't misunderstand me. I'm not making fun of this at all. I mean, I've been through it. I've been there. Yeah, exactly, Ben. He lives within my heart. So my simple point is, that's been the conviction of Christians forever. And I would suggest to you that's Paul as well. Paul is saying that's exactly what Paul says. Remember, he says, I went up to Jerusalem by revelation, right? Christ told me. In 2 Corinthians 10:11, he says, I had a physical problem, and I begged the Lord to take it away from me. And he said, no, this is, you got to deal with this. This is what I'm letting you have. And then he says in Galatians, he called me to do this thing, and I had to give up the other stuff. I was persecuting the followers of Christ, as the Jewish Christian followers. I was a Pharisee. I was into this. That's how much zeal I had for my traditions. I was persecuting those who followed Christ back in Jerusalem days. But when he who had set me apart before my birth called me to preach to the Gentiles, I gave it up and I went and did this. And then he has that strange story in 2 Corinthians 11, in which he says, I know someone, I'm not going to boast about myself, but I know someone who was caught up into the third heaven and saw unspeakable things, in paradise. Paul is claiming to have had everybody, even ancient world said, that's Paul. That's Paul talking about himself. He's just saying, I don't want to talk about myself. So he's putting it on someone else, but he's talking about himself. So he's talking about spiritual experiences. And it seems to me very clear that that's why he thought Paul was why Christ was raised. Pardon me. So as time goes on, however, in early Christianity, that's not good enough, right? Because it sounds too wishy-washy. It's
anyone can have an
yeah,
apparition, a
yeah,
ghost. Yeah.
yeah. It's like it's in the realm of Elvis, right?
Yep.
It's like, okay, or John F. Kennedy, or everybody else people have thought is still alive, right? Um, so the stories became more and more concrete, and Mark is already now the first one with the stone, right? And now the miracle is that the stone is rolled away, but even there, the stone is rolled away to reveal that he's not there. So the stone didn't need to be rolled away for him to get out, right? That's the point.
Hey, Joe Roman, you got an empty tomb I can use as a... No, I'm just kidding with you.
but the point is that as the stories go on, they become more and more concrete. And
Right.
so now in Matthew, you have a guard placed over the tomb because the story is his disciples were going to steal the body.
Thomas is over here. It takes more and more, right?
And
we're going to be getting into the second century Christian, or the second generation.
Yeah.
Dude, this is so good. I love this. So do you think he's schizophrenic, or do you think this is just a guy like any other religious guy potentially who's extremely passionate and he's just crazy as hell like I was?
I think we should, I think I should avoid any kind. I'm not a competent psychologist, psychiatrist, nor do we have the kind of evidence that would allow us to say that. But I think, Derek, you make a very good point that we've all been, or many of us have been there and felt religious experiences. And I think it would be unwise, really, to categorize all of this as psychosis, or even if it maybe was. But I think it's just so general in the human population, that I'm reluctant to go there. And I don't know in Paul's case.
Okay.
No idea.
Everybody hit that like button, man. Like, help us out. This has been a wonderful live. And so we got like 2 more super chats. And then I got one question that I did collect here. If you guys want to super chat your question, please do so. It is my birthday. Keep in mind, I am going to be selfish and literally say that. I'm going to brag. No shame in the plug. It's my birthday. You guys can always help a birthday boy out. Okay. So John's question, what do you think of the we passages of Acts? Does it indicate that Acts was written by a companion of Paul? And the question I ask, I guess, would be, we're going to have to probably get into this deep in Luke Acts when we get into the series of Luke Acts. We'll do like a whole episode on that. But can you briefly give us what your thoughts are?
I think first of all, Acts is so much at odds with Paul's letters, fundamentally at odds with Paul's letters about the number of, Paul would see them as visits to Jerusalem. The writer of Acts would see Paul's visits away from Jerusalem. So that's already a big difference. But they don't add up at all. Like, Paul's very clear, right, in Galatians about how many times he visited Jerusalem, only twice, and only for these reasons. And they just don't add up with Acts 9, Acts 13, Acts 15, Acts 21. So Acts is in a whole different space, even though it's trying to, it's trying to domesticate Paul, I think, and find a nice place for him where he's kind of harmless. But it's not like the real Paul. So I don't think that the we passages refer to a real companion of Paul's. The simplest explanation is that they are meant to be vivid encounters to convey the authority of the writer, to say, we did this together. But the author is anonymous and doesn't want to intrude too much. So he's doing it in a subtle way. But it's pretty clear. We did this. We were there. So he's claiming eyewitness evidence as the foundation of his text.
So the reader is buying what he's selling.
Yeah.
That makes perfect.
And that's not uncommon, in ancient writing to pull out.
The Gospels do that too,
and ancient historians do it. They pull out every rhetorical trick to persuade you that they know what they're talking about.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
We're going to be probing deep into that under a microscope and then one of these upcoming ones. So here we have Ben again. Don't have another question. Just looking forward to his talk on Mark and Luke Acts. Thank you for the super chat, Ben. And all
Thanks, Ben.
Everybody showed so much love. I really thought that was a question because I saw the word question and I was like, okay, let me screenshot this. And thanks, Ben, man. I appreciate you, bro, for real. And then Ray Oshima, I hope I'm saying that correct. Thank you for the super chat you just gave me. I really appreciate it. Guys, I have pinned the Patreon. If you're not a Patreon member, there's hundreds of videos you have not seen that I've edited. And a lot of people have been commenting lately about like, give me short versions of your content. I can't sit through this, right? So they'd be dying right now. We're almost at 3 hours. We just hit 3 hours as I said that. So my point is they can't handle this time. They don't have that time. Well, on Patreon, I just started doing little nuggets, like things I think will be like, oh, you're going to want to hear this. This is 5 minutes. You know, this is 7 minutes. This is 3 minutes, whatever. And I did that with some of my recent stuff. I'm a one-man army, so I don't have the time, the energy, the resources to really, do that with everything I've done. But who knows? I might have time in the future. I have one more question from None-Believer that I have. And he didn't super chat it, but I just saw it. And I said, let me grab that because he super chatted it like a million times on other videos. Peter also has a Hebrew origin. Does Dr. Mason know about that? And this was brought up during your conversation about him naming him Peter. And so.
Yeah. So his name is Shimon in Hebrew. Simon, we say. Simeon. It's all forms of Shimon. According to the Gospels. So Jesus, according to the Gospels, sees Simon and Andrew, his brother, fishermen casting nets. He calls him, and depending on which Gospel you read, either then or later, and halfway through the Gospel, he gives him a new name, Cephas, or Kepha in Aramaic. And then that comes over into Greek as Petros. So it's all rocky, something like that. One can imagine why he got that name. I don't know. But anyway, that becomes the rock of the church and, Peter's successors as popes in the Catholic tradition. Yeah. So, I'm not sure what else might have been behind the question, but
just wanting to know if you knew the root probably to it in Hebrew. And I thought it was fascinating because I've been reading a book right now. I'm going to do an episode on this in July with Dr. Why did I just forget his name? It literally just left my head. On the Israel idea, Jason Staples. And he talks about this part you brought up today. I'm a Hebrew of Hebrews. That idea he showed with all the literature surrounding is in Josephus and other places. It seems to imply language by the time of the first century, because obviously the patriarchs were Hebrews and whatnot. But like Paul's trying to say, I know how to read your word. I know how to read the languages, either in Aramaic or Hebrew. But like he's a Hebrew of Hebrews, like he knows the languages. Not that there's like, here's this special group, Hebrew ethnicity, and then you have Israelites and you have Jews. Like that was the implication there. And I just thought that was interesting to note. Did you want to comment on that?
Can I already register a different view?
Please do. Yeah. I haven't heard any other views. So
okay. I think that's well. Look, it could be right, but I think that the point is the way I want to interpret a text is in its own context, and not in light of Josephus. He's doing a whole different thing. So it's true that in Josephus, to Hebraize or something is to speak in Hebrew and so on. But in Paul's context, I'm a Hebrew of the Hebrews in Philippians 3. The context there is I'm the genuine article. I know all about this stuff. I'm from the tribe of Benjamin. I'm a Pharisee. I've got the lineage. I'm not a Gentile, I think. But the reason I mention it is not to be disagreeing with your other future guest, but because Paul's biblical interpretation depends on the Septuagint. It depends on the Greek translation. So, for example, in Habakkuk 2:4, what it says in Hebrew is the person who, you'll know a righteous person because the person who is righteous, that is, observes God's laws, that's how you become righteous, will find life, will have life because of his faithfulness, his emunah, his faithfulness to God will make him, will give him life because he's been righteous. And that's the reward God will give him. That's what it says in the Hebrew. In the Septuagint, in the Greek Bible, it becomes the one who is righteous by his faith will live. And it's not necessarily saying anything different. It's just put in a different order. But Paul seizes on that order and says, okay, what that text says is it's the one who is righteous by faith, not by observing the law, who will have life. So here I have a proof text that it's by faith in Christ and not by following the law that you will have life. That's not what Habakkuk says. That would be contrary to everything in the Bible, right? That would be a total overthrow of the Bible. But that's what Paul takes from it because he's using the Greek formulation and giving it a little twist, right?
This is kind of like Matthew when he uses the whole. I think it's in Amos. Maybe it's in Joel. I can't remember which passage about the ox or the ass and the colt.
Yeah.
And the Hebrew parallelism. So it's like it just repeats the same thing. And Matthew's like literally reading this Greek, and he's like, all right, we've got 2 donkeys. All right, Jesus rode both of these suckers. Yeah. And I just think it's so funny, like the way that he takes it from the Greek and literalizes, but it's a Hebrew parallelism. So
yeah, it's a Hebrew parallelism that is either not understood or botched up. But Matthew, exactly same thing with the famous, virgin will bear a son. Matthew seizes on the word for virgin, which is only in the Greek Bible, right? And similarly with John the Baptist, what the Bible says is a voice cries. A voice cries. What does the voice cry? In the wilderness, prepare a highway for God, make straight the paths of the Lord. Hebrew parallelism. That's what a voice cries. In the wilderness, prepare a highway for God. So in the Septuagint, it comes across as a voice crying in the wilderness, right? And so in the Gospels, it's taken over that way. It doesn't matter what he cries. It's that he's a voice in the wilderness, and John was in the wilderness. So he's a voice. So he's a voice crying it in the wilderness. That's not what the passage said. Right, but it only makes sense in the Greek version of the Bible. Yeah. So Paul is doing that. He depends on the Greek translation of the Bible. So I think it's a bit of a problem to say that he's really advertising his Hebrew language skills.
I really love finding stuff like that. Just it kind of. People are going to say we're arrogant for this, but it's like, no, you're just looking at this stuff to say, oh, you know more than they knew. But no, like you catch them, you see what they're doing and why. And it's like, now we see, and it makes the human side shine. Anna Twink, thank you so much for the super chat. Happy birthday, Derek. I want to say to the good doctor, I love his respectful attitude to believers, although I myself am an atheist. So yeah, you're good to everybody. In fact, most scholars mock and scoff mythicists. And, I personally have a special place because it's where I came from. I understand why they think the way they do. You can disagree with them all day long, but I don't mock them. In fact, that was my whole point when I had Dr. Ehrman on, was to say, hey, can you soften your approach a little? I get you don't agree with them. You think they're wrong. That's okay. And you could say they're doing a disservice and all that. But I've heard him go on record saying that they're Holocaust deniers and this and this and that, because there might be some that are, but
wow,
I drawing those kind of lines really divides people on a whole nother level. And so prove it and show it and write it and go with your case. And that's what
if this virus has taught us anything, man, it's we need to stick together. We're all broken, and we're all coming from some place One of my favorite poet singers is, Leonard Cohen. I don't know. I'm old, right? And he was big back in the day. You may have heard of him, but he has some great songs along this line. Like everything is broken. And he has one line about this. That's how the light gets in, right? That through the brokenness is where the light gets in. We're all broken. We all came from somewhere. We're all trying to do our best here. So I don't think it's not any kind of special love for particular people. It's just like, hey, we have to respect each other, and we have to see that we can put on an appearance that we got it all straightened out. And that's what you hear in social media all the time, right? Is people posturing, whether it's about the Middle East crisis or about coronavirus or about the truth of early Christianity, people posturing, saying, this is it, come on, go back and read your history, or smarten up, have some critical thing, whatever it is. Come on, we all gotta, what we're doing here is trying to reason together. Even there's a line in the Bible itself, come now, reason together, let us reason together. Mm-hmm. That's what we're doing here, in my view.
We're doing it as historians, and I'm a student. I don't claim to know, which is one of the reasons I don't go on YouTube and debate. Like, there's so many people who debate. I have a lot of learning to do before I think I could stand as some authority on a subject matter and pretend to have better answers than the guy I'm standing up against. Don't get me wrong. I love debates. I love listening to them, but it's like most of the time you see it. It's like a football team. No one goes in supporting the Broncos and the other side supporting the Redskins and change sides during a match. It just doesn't happen. It's not meant that way. It's like, get up, come on. It's a gladiator ring, blood, Spartan theology. Speaking of which, Spartan theology is a good friend of mine, and go subscribe to his channel, please. He's trying to grow his YouTube. He is a Christian, but he's an open-minded kind of guy. He's not a fundamentalist like I was. And, he's a great community. So you guys go show him some love and be respectful. He says, as a Christian, I really appreciate this channel and the great work Derek is bringing to YouTube. And, we've been talking. He's on Facebook as well. But this is a great community. I love learning this stuff from you. If anyone has a final question, super chat it. Other than that, I'm going to do a shameless plug, if that's okay, in the meantime. So if any super chats come through with a question, I will ask. But once again, those shorter clips, if you guys are interested, and I have long ones, all those Dr. Price videos that I sit there and record in person and ask your questions, those are all on here on my Patreon. So you guys get early access. You see my brain. Nobody's allowed to see my brain other than Patreon members. But yeah, like I spend a lot of time, man, making these thumbnails. We talk about the AJ guy, the guy that claimed to be Jesus. I shortened some of these clips. This has not been released yet. Neither has the first one. Where's it at? This one right here, ethics. Right, wrong, without God. Can you have right and wrong without God? This is really interesting stuff. The Exodus is another one. We just launched this one yesterday. Exodus. This is the long version. So when you see this, you're going to want to see this, by the way. Cultural memory, not an actual historical, literal. He does a fantastic job. And then Lawrence Krauss, I broke down that interview I did with him into small sections. So 2-3 minute clips even. But then you get into the juicy stuff. There's Elaine Pagels, and you get into Berosus and Genesis and Dr. Price. Look, I wanted people to see there's so much you have not seen on the Patreon. And then some of it's small excerpts that you have. And then Dr. Mason's books. These are actually in MythVision recommended down in the description. I got to add this one to the list because I didn't see this one. So what I do is I go in here and I go right here, MythVision Podcast recommended. I add it. Oh, it's already been added. So I did have it added. See, you guys can go down there and get his book. You got to get it now. I mean, you are so thorough, man. And there's GoFundMe's too. So if you guys want to support the in-person for Elaine Pagels or support the John J. Collins, Joel Baden, that is going to be coming up sometime soon, you can do that.
Or your trip to Europe that you're planning.
I would love that. Well, we'll set that up when the time comes. I got to figure out how international stuff works right now in light of the COVID.
Yeah.
But yeah, there you have it, man. I got to plug it. I got to plug it. Would you want to say something else? Like tease us about the second generation of Christians? Can you get us like a cliffhanger? I guess like this is what we can be looking forward to.
Yeah, the second generation is basically, so I tried to use Paul, as you noticed, to look at the first generation, and the second generation, Mark. Mark is the least studied of the texts because basically Matthew and Luke and John is the most, famous. Luke Acts and Matthew take over pretty much all of Mark. So why bother reading Mark anymore? Matthew and Luke are like they're the ones with the Lord's Prayer and all that stuff, and that isn't in Mark. The birth narrative's not in Mark. Resurrection story not in Mark in any detail. So Mark is like this really odd text, and that's why I want to look at it and we'll look at the others, but through the lens of Mark, because I want to suggest to you that what got all of this rolling was that this guy was a follower of Paul. And he interpreted Jesus' life, so he completely accommodated Jesus' life to the announcement of Paul in very striking ways. And that will lead us to the question of the historical Jesus at the end of that session, a little bit.
Yeah, and I guess we'll be looking back at Paul while we do this too and going, what was this guy doing? Because a lot of what mythicists will do is focus on Paul and say, show me the guy on earth. Why did he mention Pontius Pilate? Why didn't they mention, the tomb? Why didn't they? And a lot of this stuff doesn't get mentioned. So this is going to be interesting. Stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen. Hit the like button before you go. I really appreciate you guys. Thanks for all the birthday gifts and everything. I really love doing this. We've now changed this day. See, the day used to be Saturday, Friday night to Saturday night as the Sabbath. Then the Christians came on the scene and it was Sunday. Okay. We have taken Sunday. Okay. It is MythVision Day. Okay. That is it. This is the holy Sabbath of the gods. I'm being silly. I really appreciate you, Dr. Mason. Let's do this again.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Derek. Happy birthday, my friend.
Thank you.
You still have some time. This has been very long, but you still have some time left, right, to celebrate?
Yeah. Well, 30. Let's see. I'm 33 now. How long into this age I have till I'm crucified, and I have to show everyone that I did physically rise, not just spiritually. That's something that we have to discuss in private. I don't want the public to know this, as Mark says. Keep it hush hush. We'll keep the inner circle aware of the truth, and then the rest of the people can guess. Yeah, there you go.
Okay. Hey, it's been fun. Really enjoyed it.
You too.
I apologize for the length of this thing. Please, I just never think about the time we get into it, and there you go. But
look, I already know what we're about to do. When you get on, I'm like, all right, let me plan out my whole but it's always good. It's always good. So
okay.
Thank you, Dr. Mason. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have stuck around this long, I love you. Seriously. I don't care if you disagree with me. If you think I'm nuts, I don't care. I love you. And I might think you're crazy too, but that's okay because we are MythVision.